Hello everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. I can't believe I'm finally typing this out. For 32 years, I've only told this story to my immediate family and a couple close friends, mostly because I know how it sounds. But after stumbling across similar accounts online recently, I feel like I need to share what happened to me that summer evening in 1991. I was 48 at the time, living in Michigan's Upper Peninsula. I've been an equestrian most of my life, and back then, I owned a beautiful white gelding named Silver. We'd go riding almost daily when weather permitted, and I knew the forests around our property like the back of my hand. That July, my husband and I had set up a small camp about 4 miles from our house on a piece of land owned by my brother-in-law. Nothing fancy, just a couple of tents, a fire pit, and a makeshift corral for Silver. We were planning to spend about a week there, enjoying the summer weather and exploring some of the less traveled trails. On our third day at camp, my husband decided to drive back to the house to pick up some supplies we'd forgotten. I chose to stay behind and take Silver for an evening ride. It was around 6:30, still plenty of daylight left, though the sun was starting to get lower. The weather was perfect, about 75 degrees, light breeze, and those big puffy clouds that make the sky look like a painting. I saddled up Silver, and we headed out on a dirt logging road that cut through a dense section of pine and hardwood forest. Silver was in good spirits, trotting along happily as we made our way deeper into the woods. Everything felt so normal, so peaceful. I remember thinking how lucky I was to have this beautiful place practically to myself. We'd gone about 1.5 miles from camp when Silver's behavior changed dramatically. He suddenly stopped dead in his tracks. I mean, completely frozen. In all my years riding him, I'd never seen him act like this. His ears shot forward, his muscles tensed, and he stared intently into the trees to our right. I tried nudging him forward with my heels, but he wouldn't budge an inch. What is it, boy?" I asked, patting his neck, trying to calm him down. But he just kept staring. I followed his gaze, squinting to see what had caught his attention. At first, I couldn't make out anything unusual, just trees, underbrush, and lengthening shadows. But then I saw movement. Something white was moving through the forest about 50 yards away. My first thought was that another rider was out there on a white horse, which made absolutely no sense because I was currently sitting on the only white horse for miles around. Yet what I was seeing looked so much like Silver that for a split second I had this crazy thought that I was somehow seeing us, like some kind of weird mirage or reflection. As I watched, the white figure began moving toward us with alarming speed. Not charging exactly, but covering ground quickly, weaving between trees with purpose. The similarity to a horse was uncanny from the front. The same pure white coloration as Silver, similar height and general shape of the head. But there was something off about it, something my brain couldn't quite process. Silver began to tremble beneath me, not the normal kind of nervous shifting he might do when startled by a deer or fox, but a deep, full-body trembling I'd never felt from him before. He snorted loudly, pawing at the ground, clearly wanting to bolt, but too disciplined to do so without my command. When the creature got within about 30 yards of us, it suddenly stopped. For a moment, it just stood there, partially obscured by brush, but clearly visible enough to tell it was no ordinary animal. Then it turned to its side, and that's when I realized what was wrong. This thing wasn't a horse at all. It was standing upright on 2 legs. Its body was narrow, nothing like the substantial barrel of an equine. It was covered in what looked like white hair or fur, not particularly long, but dense all over its body. The proportions were all wrong for a human, too tall, too lean, the limbs somehow elongated. I couldn't make out facial features clearly, but the head shape was vaguely horse-like from the front, though not exactly right. The white thing suddenly changed direction and moved laterally behind a stand of pine trees. I expected to see it emerge on the other side, but it never did. It simply vanished. What disturbed me most in that moment was the complete silence. This thing had just run through dense undergrowth and a thick patch of wild blueberries, but there wasn't a sound. No cracking twigs, no rustling leaves, nothing. It moved like a ghost. The sun was now noticeably lower, and the forest was getting darker by the minute. A cold feeling of dread washed over me. Silver was still trembling, his breathing heavy and anxious. I'm not ashamed to admit I was terrified. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to get out of there. I turned Silver around and urged him back toward camp. He didn't need any encouragement. He practically flew down the trail, faster than I would normally allow on the uneven terrain. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see that white figure following us, but the trail behind us remained empty. When we got back to camp, I quickly secured Silver in his corral and gave him extra feed to calm him down. He remained agitated all evening, repeatedly looking toward the forest and nickering softly, something he rarely did. I sat by the campfire with my husband's shotgun across my lap until he returned around 9:30 that night. When I told my husband what had happened, he was concerned but skeptical. He suggested I might have seen another horse that had gotten loose, or maybe a large white-tailed deer with an unusual coloration. But I knew what I saw wasn't anything normal. The way it moved, its bipedal stance, the impossible silence. None of it made sense for any animal native to Michigan. We stayed at the camp for 2 more days, but I didn't go riding alone again. My husband accompanied me on hikes, bringing the shotgun along just in case, though I could tell he was humoring me more than anything else. What's strange is that about 2 weeks later, my 2 teenage children were four-wheeling in roughly the same area when they came home excited about seeing what they described as a white thing running through the trees. They hadn't gotten as close a look as I had, but the fact that they saw something similar in the same location made my skin crawl. That area was logged the following year, and the landscape changed considerably. I kept riding Silver there for years afterward, but never saw the white creature again. My family eventually turned it into a running joke, teasing me about my albino Sasquatch sighting whenever we'd go camping. But Silver and I knew what we saw. Looking back, I've often wondered if the creature approached us because it was curious about Silver. Maybe it mistook him for one of its own kind due to the similar coloration. The area where we spotted it had plenty of places something could hide. Numerous bluffs, caves, and a large ridge running behind that section of forest. It's rugged country, and there are still parts rarely visited by humans. I regret not investigating further at the time, not looking for tracks or other evidence. But the fear I felt in that moment was unlike anything I'd experienced before or since. It wasn't just being startled or spooked. It was a deep, primal fear. Like my body knew instinctively that whatever I was seeing was fundamentally wrong and dangerous. Silver passed away 12 years ago at the age of 27, but he lived a good long life for a horse. Sometimes I'd catch him staring into those woods with the same intensity he showed that day, even years later. I always wondered if he sensed something out there that I couldn't. I've researched similar sightings over the years, but found very little that matches what I saw. Most cryptid reports describe dark-colored creatures, not white ones. The closest matches I've found are a few obscure accounts of white things seen in Appalachia and scattered reports of pale, upright creatures in forested areas across North America. I'm 79 years old now, and I've had a lot of time to think about what happened that day. I know what I saw wasn't a bear standing on its hind legs, wasn't a deer, wasn't a person in a costume, and certainly wasn't another horse. Silver's reaction alone confirms that. Horses don't respond that way to normal forest animals they encounter regularly. To this day, I avoid being in those woods after sunset. Call it superstition if you want, but once you've seen something like that, something that shouldn't exist according to everything you've been taught about the natural world, it changes you. You realize the world is bigger and stranger than you thought, and some things are better left alone. I've never shared this publicly before, but I'm getting older, and I don't want this experience to disappear when I'm gone. If anyone else has seen something similar in the Upper Peninsula or elsewhere, I'd be grateful to hear about it. Sometimes I still dream about that white figure moving silently through the trees, and I wake up with the same cold dread I felt all those years ago on that logging road with Silver. Story 2. I've been debating whether to share this for months now. Part of me thinks putting it down in writing might help me process what happened, but another part worries you'll all think I'm crazy or making this up. I'm not. I wish I was. I've been hunting the same patch of land near Floodwood, Minnesota for 10 years. It's state land about 5 miles out from town on County Road 8, just past the power line road before you hit the gravel bridge. Nothing special to most people, but to me, it was practically sacred ground. I knew every trail, every clearing, every spot where the deer liked to bed down. Hell, I could practically navigate it blindfolded. Last November, during rifle season, everything changed. I still get goosebumps thinking about it. It was a Tuesday afternoon, unseasonably cold but clear, perfect hunting weather. I'd taken the day off work and was in my stand since noon. My spot was about a mile in from where I parked my truck, in a cluster of pines overlooking a small clearing and a cedar swamp. I'd been coming to this exact stand for years without incident. By 4:45, I hadn't seen a single deer, which was unusual for that time of day. The woods were dead quiet. No squirrels, no birds, nothing. Looking back, that silence should have been my first warning. In all my years hunting those woods, I'd never experienced that kind of stillness. I was starting to think about packing it in when I heard a loud snap about 50 yards to my left. Not the light sound of a deer moving through brush. This was the unmistakable sound of a thick branch breaking under substantial weight. My first thought was bear. I'd put out some bait earlier that week, and we'd had a few black bears in the area. I slowly turned my head toward the sound, staying as still as possible. Another snap, closer this time. Whatever it was big and moving directly toward my position. I carefully raised my .308 just in case. The safety was still on, but my finger rested near the trigger. Then I caught movement in my peripheral vision, something large and dark moving between the trees about 40 yards out. I raised my scope to get a better look, thinking maybe it was a big bull moose that had wandered down from the north. What I saw through that scope made my blood run cold. It wasn't a moose. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't anything I could explain. Standing there, partially obscured by a cluster of pines, was something massive and bipedal. My first rational thought was that it must be another hunter in dark clothing. But as I lowered my scope and looked directly at it, I realized this was no human. The thing stood at least 8 feet tall, maybe more. It had the body shape of a gorilla. Massive shoulders, long arms, thick muscular build. But this was northern Minnesota, not the Congo. It was covered in dark brown, almost black matted fur. What struck me most was its head, or rather the lack of a neck. Its head seemed to sit directly on those massive shoulders, giving it a hunched appearance. I'm not ashamed to admit I froze completely. My hands were shaking so badly I couldn't have fired my rifle if I'd wanted to. For what felt like an eternity, but was probably only seconds, I just stared at it, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Then it noticed me. Our eyes met across that distance, and I felt something I've never experienced before or since. A primal fear so deep, it bypassed all rational thought. This wasn't the normal fear of encountering a predator in the woods. This was something ancient and visceral, like my DNA itself recognized a threat my conscious mind couldn't comprehend. The creature turned its entire body toward me, and that's when it let out a sound I'll never forget. It wasn't a growl or a roar like any animal I've heard. It was deeper, louder, almost guttural, a sound that vibrated in my chest cavity and echoed through the swamp. I swear I could feel the platform of my deer stand vibrating with it. That sound broke my paralysis. I was so terrified I nearly fell out of my stand, 15 feet up. I gripped the railing with white knuckles, my rifle almost slipping from my grasp. The creature seemed to sense my fear. It took one step forward, then another. Each footfall made a distinct impression in the forest floor, much deeper than any human would make. I could see its muscles rippling under that thick fur as it moved. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it turned and crashed through the underbrush away from me. The speed was unbelievable. It covered about 100 yards in seconds, moving through thick brush that would have taken me minutes to navigate. Just before it disappeared from view, it stopped and turned back in my direction. It let out another roar, louder than the first, if that was possible, then continued moving until the sounds faded toward the southwest. I sat in my stand, unable to move, for at least 20 minutes. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. I kept the rifle trained in the direction it had gone, safety now off, hands still trembling. When I finally convinced myself it wasn't coming back, I climbed down from my stand as quietly as possible. Then I ran. I ran the entire mile back to my truck, crashing through cedar swamps and tripping over fallen logs. I didn't care about being quiet anymore. I just needed to get out of those woods. I kept my rifle at the ready, safety off, something I've never done in 30 years of hunting. It's the kind of thing that would have earned me a serious lecture from my father. But in that moment, all hunters' safety rules seemed irrelevant compared to what I'd just encountered. By the time I reached my truck, I was soaked with sweat, despite the freezing temperature. I threw my gear in the back and peeled out of there, gravel flying. I didn't even bother to properly secure my rifle case. I just needed distance between me and whatever that thing was. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those eyes staring back at me. I heard that roar echoing in my head. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a bear standing on its hind legs. Maybe it was some kind of optical illusion caused by the fading light. But I know what I saw. The next morning, I called in sick to work. I spent hours online searching for explanations. That's when I found descriptions of Bigfoot encounters that matched what I'd experienced. The height, the build, the lack of neck, the speed, even that distinctive roar. I've always been skeptical about Bigfoot. I thought it was just stories made up by attention seekers or people who'd had too much to drink around a campfire. Now I don't know what to believe. I debated reporting it to the DNR or local authorities, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. Who would believe me, a lifelong hunter claiming to have seen a mythical creature in the woods? I'd be laughed out of town. I left all my gear in the truck for a week. When I finally unpacked, I found deep scratches on my stand that hadn't been there before. Maybe from a bear, but they seemed too deliberate, too evenly spaced. I've examined them 100 times and still can't explain them. I sold my hunting property 3 months later, couldn't bring myself to go back. My wife thinks I'm having some kind of breakdown. Maybe I am, but I know what I saw, and I know those woods don't belong to us. Not entirely. I've moved my hunting grounds about 70 miles east now. I still go out, but never alone, and never without checking over my shoulder. I carry a sidearm now too. Not that I think it would do much good against something that size, but it gives me some small comfort. Sometimes at night, I still hear that roar in my dreams. I wake up in a cold sweat, convinced it's found me. My wife says I've been talking in my sleep, describing the thing in the woods over and over. I don't know what I encountered that day. I don't have proof beyond my own experience. But I know what I saw, and it fundamentally changed how I view the wilderness I thought I knew so well. The woods feel different to me now, older, more mysterious, and infinitely more dangerous. There are things out there we don't understand, things that have perhaps been there all along, watching us from the shadows while we remained blissfully unaware. I'm writing this not to convince anyone, but because I need someone else to know. If you're hunting those woods near Floodwood, especially around County Road 8 past the power line, keep your eyes open and your wits about you. And if the woods go silent, completely, unnaturally silent, get out. Don't wait. Don't investigate. Just leave. Because whatever's out there, it knows you're there long before you know about it. Story 3. I've never really told this story to anyone outside my immediate family. It's been almost 50 years, but I still get chills when I think about what happened that night. I don't know what we saw, but I know it wasn't human. It was December 1973. I was 24, a naval officer stationed in San Diego, and my wife Amelia and I were driving back from visiting her parents in Denver with our 3-month-old daughter. We had a little yellow Volkswagen Beetle, not the ideal vehicle for winter driving, but it was all we had. The plan was to take Highway 40 through northern Arizona, then head south to California. The weather forecast had mentioned possible snow, but nothing prepared us for the blizzard that hit as we approached the mountains northwest of Flagstaff. It came out of nowhere. 1 minute we were driving under cloudy skies, and the next we could barely see 10 feet in front of us. The snow was coming down so thick and fast that the wipers couldn't keep up. I remember gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. Amelia was in the passenger seat, holding our baby girl who, thankfully, was sleeping through it all. The heater in that old Beetle was barely working, and we were all bundled up in winter coats, hats, and blankets. "Michael, maybe we should find somewhere to stop," Amelia said, her voice tight with worry. "This is getting dangerous." She was right. The road was completely covered in snow, and I couldn't even tell where the lanes were anymore. We hadn't seen another car for at least an hour. It was just us, alone on that mountain road, with the snow piling up by the minute. "Let me just check where we are," I said, pulling over to what I hoped was the side of the road. I left the engine running for the heat and the headlights. The snow was falling so heavily that it immediately started to cover the windshield. I reached into the glove compartment for our map, unfolded it across the steering wheel, and flicked on the interior light so I could see better. That's when it happened. I was looking down at the map, trying to find our location, when something in the rearview mirror caught my eye. At first, I thought it was just snow swirling in the headlight's reflection. But then I realized it was moving fast and with purpose. I adjusted the mirror and felt my blood run cold. Something was running toward our car from behind. "Amelia," I whispered, not wanting to scare her but needing her to look. "Do you see that?" She turned around in her seat, and I heard her sharp intake of breath. "What is that?" she whispered back. I twisted around for a better look, and that's when I saw it clearly. Through the back window, illuminated by our taillights against the swirling snow, was the most terrifying thing I've ever seen. It was massive, at least 10 feet tall, and covered in dark fur, mostly black, but with patches of dark brown. It was running on 2 legs, moving through the deep snow with impossible speed and agility. Its arms were unnaturally long, hanging down almost to its knees, and its legs were long too, taking huge strides that ate up the distance between us. But what still haunts me to this day was its head. It had this strange pyramid shape, rounded at the top, and the face, God, the face was covered in the same dark fur as the rest of it, but slightly lighter in color. I couldn't make out any features clearly in the dim light and swirling snow, but I knew it was looking right at us, and it was closing in fast. "Michael!" Amelia screamed, clutching our baby to her chest. "Go!" I didn't need to be told twice. I threw the map aside, slammed the car into gear, and floored it. The tires spun helplessly for a second before finding some traction, and we lurched forward. The little Beetle wasn't built for speed, especially not in those conditions. The engine whined in protest as I pushed it harder than I ever had before. The car fishtailed on the snow-covered road, and I fought to keep control, knowing that if we went off the road or got stuck, we'd be at the mercy of whatever was chasing us. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, hoping it had given up or that I'd imagined the whole thing. But no, it was still there, still running, still gaining on us. The creature was moving through snow that had to be at least 2 feet deep, as if it were nothing more than a light dusting on pavement. "It's still coming!" Amelia cried, looking back over her shoulder. Our baby had woken up from the commotion and started wailing. "Michael, it's getting closer!" The speedometer crept up, 20, 30, 40 miles per hour. We were going way too fast for the conditions, but I didn't care. All that mattered was getting away from that thing. At one point, when it was no more than 15 feet behind us, it raised its long arms high above its head. I don't know if it was trying to appear more threatening or if it was reaching for us, but seeing those impossibly long limbs stretched out against the night sky made my skin crawl. I can still picture it perfectly, this massive, dark silhouette with arms raised, pursuing us through the snow. The beetle finally hit 45 miles per hour, and we started to pull ahead. I kept the pedal to the floor, praying that we wouldn't hit a patch of ice or drift into a ditch. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely steer. Eventually, I couldn't see it in the mirror anymore. But I didn't slow down. Not for miles and miles. We drove in terrified silence, the only sounds our heavy breathing and our daughter's frightened whimpers as Amelia tried to comfort her. It wasn't until we saw the lights of a gas station about an hour later that I finally eased off the gas. My leg was cramping from holding the pedal down for so long, and my back was soaked with sweat despite the cold. We pulled into the station, and I practically fell out of the car, my legs weak with adrenaline and fear. The attendant looked at us strangely, probably because we both looked like we'd seen a ghost. "You folks okay?" he asked, coming out of his little booth. "Roads are getting pretty bad out there." I wanted to tell him what we'd seen, to ask if others had reported something similar, but the words wouldn't come. How could I explain it without sounding completely insane? So I just nodded and asked for a fill-up, trying to act normal while scanning the darkness beyond the pool of light from the gas station. We stayed at a motel that night, neither of us willing to get back on that dark road. Amelia and I barely slept, taking turns watching our baby and staring out the window at the snow, half expecting to see that thing emerging from the darkness. In the morning, with sunlight streaming through the curtains and other travelers moving about, what we'd seen seemed almost like a bad dream, almost, but not quite, because we both saw it. We both remembered every terrifying detail. I'd always been a skeptic before that night. Whenever I heard stories about Bigfoot or Sasquatch, I'd roll my eyes. Hoaxes, mistakes, people seeing what they wanted to see. That's all those sightings were. But after what happened on Highway 40, I couldn't dismiss them anymore. Because what we saw wasn't human. No person could move that fast through deep snow. No person could be that tall, with proportions so wrong. And no costume could look that real, with fur that moved naturally in the wind and snow. Years later, when I was working at the US Mint in Denver, a co-worker brought up the topic of Bigfoot sightings in a lunch conversation. Everyone was laughing, sharing the usual jokes about guys in gorilla suits. I didn't join in, I couldn't. "You don't think they're real, do you, Reynolds?" someone asked, noticing my silence. I just shrugged and mumbled something about keeping an open mind. What else could I say? That my wife and I had been chased by something impossible? That I still had nightmares about a fur-covered face illuminated by taillights in a snowstorm? Amelia and I have talked about it over the years, trying to make sense of what happened. Was it some kind of bear, a moose, some other animal distorted by fear and poor visibility? But neither of us believes that. What we saw was bipedal, deliberate in its movements, and clearly chasing us with intent. I'm 54 years old now, and I've been all over the world with the Navy. I've seen things that most people wouldn't believe, But nothing has ever shaken me like that night in 1973. Sometimes on cold winter nights when the wind is howling outside, I find myself checking the windows and doors, making sure they're locked tight. Because somewhere out there, in the remote wilderness of northern Arizona, something is still moving through the snow. Something that shouldn't exist, but does. And God help anyone who pulls over on that stretch of Highway 40 on a snowy night. I don't know what it was. I don't want to know. All I know is that it was real, it was fast, and it was hunting us. And to this day, I can't shake the feeling that we didn't escape because we outran it. We escaped because it let us go. Story 4. I still can't believe I'm sharing this, but it's been almost 50 years, and I need to tell someone who might understand what we saw that night. August of '74. I was 17 then, thought I knew everything about the natural world. Turns out I didn't know shit. Me and 3 of my buddies from the science club, Mike, Dave and Tom, had gone camping in the Angeles National Forest. We were these nerdy science kids who'd rather identify species of plants than go to parties. My dad had this old cabin we could use about 20 miles from civilization, deep in the woods near a creek. No electricity, just an old propane lantern and a wood stove, with an outhouse about 50 yards from the cabin. We'd spent the day hiking, collecting soil samples and photographing some interesting fungi we'd found. Normal science club stuff. We were planning to analyze everything back at school in the fall. After dinner, canned beans and hot dogs, we weren't exactly gourmet, we sat around playing cards and talking about college applications. It must have been around midnight when I needed to use the outhouse. I remember checking my watch. It was 12:17. The moon was almost full that night, so I didn't bother taking the flashlight. I figured I could see well enough, and I knew the path. I had just reached the outhouse when I noticed something moving at the edge of the clearing. At first, I thought it was just shadows from the trees in the moonlight. But then I realized that what I was seeing was actually there, physically present, about 30 yards away. It was crouched on all fours, kind of swaying back and forth in this weird, rhythmic way, like it was searching for something. The movements weren't natural, not like any animal I'd ever seen, and it was pale, not white exactly, but a light grayish color that stood out against the darkness of the trees. I remember my mouth going completely dry. I couldn't swallow, couldn't move. Part of me was trying to rationalize it. Maybe it was a bear with some kind of skin condition, but deep down, I knew that wasn't right. The proportions were all wrong. Then it stood up, not all the way upright like a human, but into this hunched position, maybe 5 or 6 feet tall, and I could see its arms. Jesus, those arms were long, too long. They hung down past where its knees should have been. The thing was covered in this shaggy, matted hair or fur, but it wasn't like a bear's fur. It was more sparse, hanging off its thin frame in clumps. I couldn't see its face clearly from where I was standing, thank God. But I could tell its head was oddly shaped, kind of elongated, with what looked like a pointed chin or snout, not quite animal, not quite human. For a few seconds, it just stood there, swaying slightly. Then it made this sound, not a growl or a screech, but this low, rattling hum that made the hair on my arms stand up. It was almost mechanical, like something that was trying to imitate an animal, but couldn't quite get it right. I don't know how long I stood there, probably only seconds, but it felt like forever. My brain was screaming at me to run, but I couldn't move. I was afraid that any movement would draw its attention. Then it dropped back down on all fours and started moving, not toward me, thank God, but parallel to where I was standing, still making that humming sound. Its movement was wrong. The way it moved its limbs wasn't like a quadruped. It was like it was mimicking how it thought a 4-legged animal should move, but couldn't quite get the coordination right. Finally, my survival instinct kicked in. I backed up slowly, 1 step at a time, toward the cabin. I didn't turn my back on it, not once. When I got about halfway back, I heard the cabin door open, and Dave called out, "Bruce, You okay out there? The thing immediately stopped moving and turned its head in the direction of Dave's voice. Then it stood up again in that half-crouch and, I swear to God, it tilted its head like it was listening. That's when I broke and ran the rest of the way back to the cabin. I burst through the door, slamming it behind me, gasping for breath. There's something out there, I managed to say. Dave looked freaked out. I saw it too, just for a second when I opened the door. What the hell is that thing? Mike and Tom were up now too. What's going on? Tom asked. There's some kind of creature out there, I said, still trying to catch my breath. Not a bear, not anything I've ever seen before. We grabbed the flashlights and looked out the windows. For a minute we didn't see anything. Then Tom spotted it, now at the edge of the clearing near the outhouse. All four of us saw it clearly in the moonlight. That same pale, shaggy figure, now moving on all fours again, circling the perimeter of the clearing. What the fuck is that? Mike whispered. He was the skeptic of our group, the one who always had a logical explanation for everything. But even he was shaken. Should we try to take a picture? Tom suggested. He had his camera, but it was loaded with the black and white film we'd been using for our fungi documentation. Before we could decide, the thing stopped moving again. It raised its head, and even from this distance, I swear it was looking directly at us through the window. Then, it made that humming sound again, louder this time. No way that's a bear, Dave said quietly. The proportions are all wrong. The way it moves is all wrong. Could it be someone in a costume? Mike suggested, but his voice made it clear he didn't believe that either. No way, I said. No human moves like that. And did you see how long its arms are? We watched as it circled the clearing again, then stopped near the path that led deeper into the forest. It stood up in that half-crouch position again, and this time it raised one of those impossibly long arms and seemed to point at our cabin. At least, that's what it looked like. Then it dropped back down and moved into the trees, disappearing from view. We spent the rest of the night huddled in the cabin, taking turns keeping watch. None of us slept. We kept all the lights on and piled furniture against the door. Every noise from outside made us jump. Around 4 in the morning we heard it again, that low, rattling hum, but this time from somewhere behind the cabin. Mike wanted to look out the back window, but Dave and I talked him out of it. None of us wanted to see that thing up close. The humming continued on and off for about 20 minutes, sometimes sounding like it was right outside the wall, other times like it was circling the cabin. Then we heard a sharp, cracking sound, like a branch breaking, and after that, silence. When dawn finally came, we cautiously went outside. The forest looked normal in the daylight, peaceful even. But near the outhouse we found strange indentations in the dirt, not quite footprints, more like impressions where something heavy had been. They didn't look like any animal tracks I'd ever seen. They were elongated, with what looked like 4 or 5 thin protrusions at one end, like fingers or claws, and on the backside of the cabin, about 7 feet up the wall, we found tufts of coarse, whitish hair stuck in the rough wood. Dave, who was into biology, carefully collected some in a plastic bag. He said he'd try to get it analyzed when we got back to school. We packed up immediately and left, not even bothering with breakfast. The whole drive back to LA, we tried to come up with explanations. Some kind of unclassified primate, a person with a severe genetic disorder living in the woods, a hoax by some local kids who'd seen us arrive. But none of those explanations felt right. The way it moved, that mechanical humming sound, those impossible proportions, it wasn't like anything that should exist in this world. When we got back to civilization, we debated whether to report what we'd seen. Mike was against it. He said we'd sound crazy, and he was probably right. But Dave insisted, so we ended up telling a forest ranger at the station near where we'd been staying. The ranger listened to our story with a completely neutral expression. When we finished, he just nodded and said he'd make a note of it. But as we were leaving, he called me back and said quietly, You're not the first to see something like that up there, especially in that area." He wouldn't elaborate further. Dave never got the hair analyzed. When we went back to school in September, he said the biology teacher had looked at it and told him it was just fur from a common raccoon. But Dave didn't believe it, and neither did I. What we saw that night wasn't any raccoon. Over the years, I've occasionally researched unexplained sightings in the Angeles National Forest. There are others, not many, but enough to make me believe we weren't hallucinating. Most describe a similar pale, shaggy creature with unusually long limbs. It's been almost 50 years now. Mike became a doctor and refuses to talk about that night. Tom moved to Oregon and we lost touch. Dave died in a car accident in '83. I'm the only one left who still thinks about it regularly. I've never gone camping since, not once in all these years. I can't stand being in the woods at night. Sometimes I still wake up hearing that rattling hum, feeling like something with long, thin arms is standing over my bed, watching me. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't natural, and I'm convinced it wasn't alone out there. Sometimes I wonder if they're still there, those pale creatures, moving through the forest at night on their two long limbs, making that unnatural humming sound as they search for whatever it is they're looking for. Story 5. I've never really shared this with anyone outside my family. It's not something I talk about at parties or bring up in casual conversation. For one, people think you're crazy when you start talking about unexplainable things. For another, I'm still not sure what to make of it myself, even after all these years. It started back in the summer of '72. I was 13, awkward and gangly, more interested in comic books than girls at that point. My dad had gotten a new job in the county, and we'd moved into this old farmhouse that sat on 17 acres of land. The place had been empty for 30 years before we moved in, something my parents were excited about because it meant they got it for a steal. Looking back, maybe there was a reason nobody wanted it. The farmhouse itself was this massive, century-old structure with creaky floorboards and those old-fashioned windows that never quite shut right. My bedroom was upstairs, and I'd set it up with my TV so I could watch shows without my parents hogging the main one downstairs. I remember being pretty stoked about that setup. The night it happened, I was watching some program, can't even remember what now, lying on my bed with the lights off. It was around 10 at night, and Dad was working late, so it was just Mom and me in the house. I knew she was downstairs in her recliner, probably reading one of her mystery novels. I remember it was a hot night, the kind of sticky summer heat that makes your sheets feel like they're clinging to you. We didn't have air conditioning in that old place, just fans, and I had mine pointed directly at me, the hum of it almost drowning out the TV. That's when it happened. There was this boom. I can't even describe it properly. It wasn't like thunder or a car crash. It was like something massive had slammed into the house itself. My entire bed shook so hard the headboard smacked against the wall. The TV actually jumped on its stand. My first thought was that a car had crashed into our house, which was crazy because we were set way back from the road. I jumped up, heart pounding, and ran to my window. Nothing, just darkness, and the outline of trees against the night sky. No lights, no movement, nothing to explain what I'd just felt. "Thomas!" I heard my mom shouting from downstairs. "Thomas, come down here!" I bolted down those old wooden stairs, taking them two at a time, nearly slipping in my socks on the last few. When I got to the living room, Mom was standing in the middle of the room, her face white as a sheet. Her book was on the floor, and she was staring at the fireplace like she'd seen a ghost. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her voice shaky. "Did you feel that?" I nodded, trying to act braver than I felt. "What was it? A car?" "I don't know," she said. "It sounded like it hit right there." She pointed at the fireplace, an old stone thing that took up most of one wall, like something slammed right into it. We both went to the fireplace and checked it out. Nothing. Not a crack, not a mark, nothing out of place. We went to the front door and looked out the windows. Again, nothing. I'm going to check outside, I told her. I was 13, and in that moment, I felt like the man of the house with Dad gone. Mom looked worried. I don't think you should go out there alone. But I was determined. I'll take Dad's gun, I said. Dad kept a .357 revolver in his drawer, one of those things that, looking back, I probably shouldn't have known how to handle at 13, but country living was different back then. Mom hesitated, but then nodded. I got the revolver, checked that it was loaded like Dad had taught me, and grabbed a flashlight. The weight of the gun felt both reassuring and terrifying in my hand. I'd never actually fired it outside of target practice with Dad. Stepping outside into the night was like stepping into another world. It was dead silent, no crickets, no frogs, nothing. Just the sound of my own breathing and my sneakers crunching on the gravel driveway. The flashlight beam seemed pathetically small against the overwhelming darkness. I walked all around the house, checking every wall, every corner, looking for damage, for tire tracks, for anything that could explain what had happened. There was absolutely nothing. Not a mark on the house, not a track in the dirt, not a branch down from a tree. It made no sense. Then I thought maybe a car had gone off the road near our driveway entrance. Our driveway was this long, winding thing, about 1/8 of a mile from the main road. So I started walking up it, the flashlight beam bouncing ahead of me, the revolver gripped tightly in my sweaty hand. It was so quiet, too quiet, like the world was holding its breath. The trees on either side of the driveway seemed to lean in, watching me. I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself I was just spooked from the noise. I reached the main road and looked both ways. Empty. No cars, no skid marks, nothing out of place. It was like nothing had happened at all, which was impossible. Something had hit our house, or at least that's what it felt like. I turned back, feeling more confused than relieved. That's when I noticed the old logging road that branched off from our driveway about halfway back to the house. It was overgrown, barely visible in the dark, just a gap in the trees, really. Dad had mentioned it once, said it led deeper into the property, to an area that hadn't been logged in 50 years or more. As I passed by it, the strangest feeling came over me. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and a cold shiver ran down my spine despite the summer heat. It felt like I was being watched. No, more than that. It felt like something was staring at me with such intensity that I could physically feel its gaze. I swung the flashlight toward the logging road, my hand shaking so badly the beam danced wildly across the trees. I saw nothing, no eyes reflecting in the light, no outline of an animal or person. But the feeling didn't go away. If anything, it got stronger. And then I felt something else, a sense of not belonging, of being unwanted. It wasn't just fear. It was like the feeling you get when you walk into a room and everyone stops talking and stares at you, like you've intruded somewhere you shouldn't be. But this was 100 times stronger, a visceral rejection that seemed to come from the land itself. I didn't even think, I just ran. 13 years old, with a loaded gun in my hand, running full tilt down that driveway, certain that if I looked back, something would be right behind me. I didn't stop until I reached the porch, practically falling through the front door, gasping for breath. Mom was right there, grabbing me by the shoulders. "What? What is it? What did you see?" I couldn't explain it. How do you tell someone that nothing was chasing you, but you ran anyway, that you felt unwelcome on your own property? So I just shook my head, handed the gun back to her, and said I hadn't found anything. We checked the whole house again together, and when Dad got home, we told him what happened. He wrote it off as a branch falling on the roof, or maybe an animal running into the side of the house. But I knew better. There was no branch, no animal. Something had hit our house with deliberate force. That was the first incident, but not the last. Over the years, strange things would happen every now and then. Noises with no source, tools that would go missing from the shed, only to reappear days later in different places. Once, I found all our chickens huddled in one corner of their coop, so terrified they wouldn't come out for a whole day. My parents passed away years ago, and my wife and I moved back into the old farmhouse. I never told her the full extent of what happened that night in '72, just that the place sometimes had weird vibes. I think I was hoping whatever it was had moved on. It hadn't. In the spring of 2012, my wife let our 3 dogs out for their nighttime bathroom break around 3 in the morning. They were good dogs, a lab mix, a shepherd, and a terrier, brave and protective. She was standing on the porch waiting for them to come back when she heard what she described as a grunt from the darkness. Not a deer or a bear or anything she could identify, just this deep, resonating grunt that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The dogs, who had been happily sniffing around the yard, came tearing back to the house, pushing past her to get inside. They hid under our bed and wouldn't come out until morning. When she told me about it the next day, I felt that same cold shiver I'd felt 40 years earlier. 2 weeks after that, she was out in the yard during broad daylight, gardening near the old well. She stood up to stretch her back and saw something that still gives me chills when I think about it. A rock, not a pebble, but a good-sized rock about 4 inches across, came bouncing toward her from the direction of the power line that cuts across the far end of our property. It bounced 3 times before rolling to a stop about 10 feet away from her. The power line is over 100 yards from where she was standing. No person could throw a rock that far, certainly not with enough force for it to bounce like that. There was no one out there anyway. We would have seen them in the clear daylight. She came inside, white-faced, and told me what happened. I went out and found the rock, just a regular old piece of granite, nothing special about it except for how it had appeared. We've had other incidents over the years. Footsteps on the porch when no one's there. The distinct sound of the screen door opening and closing when it's latched shut. Once, all the cabinet doors in the kitchen were open when we came downstairs in the morning. I've tried to research the history of the property to see if anything happened here that might explain these occurrences. The house was built in 1870 by a family named Kendall. They lived here for 3 generations before selling it in the 1930s. Then it sat empty for 3 decades until we moved in. There are no records of deaths or tragedies here, no ghost stories attached to the place that I could find. Sometimes I wonder if it's not the house at all, but the land itself. Like whatever's here was here long before any house was built, long before any European settlers arrived. Maybe it's something that's always been here, watching as people come and go, waiting for us to leave again so it can have its peace. I still walk our property regularly, even at my age. I've never again felt that intense sense of being unwanted like I did that night in '72. But sometimes, when I pass the old logging road, which is even more overgrown now, I get the faintest echo of that feeling, a whisper of unwelcome, a suggestion that I'm being tolerated, not accepted. And I still don't know what hit our house that night. What made us sound like the world was ending and shook a solid farmhouse to its foundation without leaving a mark. I don't know what grunted at my wife or threw that rock from an impossible distance. I just know that after 50 years, it's still here. And so are we, sharing this land in an uneasy truce that I fear could break at any moment. Story 6. I still don't like talking about that night in Trinity County. It's been almost 50 years, and I've never told this story to anyone outside my immediate family. But after seeing similar accounts on here, I feel like maybe it's time to share what happened to me and my little brother back in '75. I was 21 that summer, home from college, and my brother Tommy was 16. We were both into backpacking, and I'd promised to take him on a real adventure before I went back to school. We were both in good shape. I was on the track team at state, and Tommy was doing cross-country in high school. We figured we could handle anything the wilderness threw at us. God, we were stupid. Our dad had an old Forest Service map of Trinity County from when he worked seasonal fire crew back in the '60s. He told us stories about how remote and beautiful some areas were, especially this one section that was barely accessible by these ancient logging roads. Real wilderness, he called it. No tourists, no designated campsites, just pure backcountry. Tommy and I were sold. We borrowed Dad's truck, beat up 72 Ford, and headed out early on a Tuesday morning in July. The drive took forever, first on highways, then county roads, then these sketchy gravel logging roads that weren't even marked. I remember at one point we had to stop and move a fallen tree branch. It felt like we were the first people up there in months. By early afternoon, we'd finally reached what looked like an old trailhead, just a small clearing where we could park the truck. The plan was to hike in about 5 miles to this valley Dad had circled on the map, camp for 2 nights, then head back out. From the moment we started hiking, things felt off. The trail was barely there, overgrown in parts, washed out in others. About 2 hours in, we realized we'd made a wrong turn somewhere. The map showed we should have been following a creek, but there was no water anywhere. We tried backtracking, but somehow got even more turned around. By late afternoon, we were both getting worried. The forest was incredibly dense, huge old-growth trees that blocked most of the sunlight. It was getting dark earlier than we expected under the canopy. Worse, we'd already gone through most of our water. I'd packed a 2-liter canteen and Tommy had a 1-liter bottle. Poor planning on my part. I kept telling Tommy it would be fine, that we'd find water soon, but I was starting to freak out a little myself. Being dehydrated in the backcountry is no joke. The terrain had gotten steeper too. We were climbing this ridge that wasn't even on our map. Around 7 in the evening, we finally caught a break. The trail dipped down into a small ravine, and we found this tiny water seep crossing the path. Not even a proper creek, just this spot where groundwater was bubbling up and making a muddy little crossing about 3 feet wide. But it was water, and we were desperate. I remember telling Tommy to wait while I checked if it was safe to drink. I'd brought purification tablets, but wanted to see how clear the source was. That's when I saw it. Right in the middle of the muddy crossing was a footprint, but not just any footprint. This thing was massive. I'm not exaggerating when I say it was at least 18 inches long and 7 inches wide at the ball of the foot. At first, my brain couldn't process what I was seeing. I thought maybe it was 2 overlapping prints or some kind of weird erosion pattern. But it wasn't. It was a single, unmistakable footprint. Human-shaped, but impossibly large. The worst part, water was still seeping back into the depression. The mud around the edges was still wet and unstable. Whatever made that print had just been there, maybe minutes before we arrived. I stood there frozen, staring at this thing. I'd heard stories, of course. Everyone who grew up in Northern California had. But I'd always written them off as campfire tales or misidentified bears. "Marty, what's wrong?" Tommy had come up beside me without me noticing. I didn't answer right away. I was scanning the forest around us, suddenly aware of how quiet it had gotten. No birds, no squirrels, nothing. "Look at this," I finally said, pointing at the print. Tommy squatted down beside me. "Holy shit," he whispered. Is that what I think it is?" "It's probably just a bear," I said, not believing it for a second. "Bear tracks don't look anything like that. Or maybe some hunter wearing weird boots." "That's not a bear, Marty, and no human has feet that big." I looked more closely at the area around the seep. Just upslope, I could see what looked like a rough game trail cutting through the underbrush. The ferns and small saplings were broken and pushed aside, creating a path up an extremely steep section that would be nearly impossible for a human to climb without gear. Whatever made that trail was powerful enough to move straight up terrain that would have us on our hands and knees. The sun was getting low. We had maybe an hour of daylight left, if that. We were miles from the truck, with no idea exactly where we were. We had no water except for this seep. We were screwed. "We need to get out of here," Tommy said, his voice cracking. "Right now." I wanted to agree with him. Every instinct was screaming at me to run. But I knew better. Night hiking in unfamiliar backcountry is a death wish, especially when you're already lost. Break an ankle in the wrong spot, and you're done. "We can't," I said finally. "It's getting dark. We need to make camp and head out at first light." Tommy looked at me like I was insane. "Camp? Here? Are you fucking kidding me?" I wasn't happy about it either. "We don't have a choice, Tommy. We can't hike out in the dark." "But that thing," he gestured at the footprint, "is right here, probably watching us right now." I looked around again, feeling the weight of unseen eyes. The forest was unnaturally still. "We'll take turns keeping watch," I said. "One sleeps, one stays awake. We've got the hunting knife and the hatchet." Tommy laughed, a high, scared sound. "Oh, great. A 3-inch blade against whatever the hell made that." He wasn't wrong, but we were out of options. We set up camp about 20 yards from the seep, on a small, flat area just off the trail. I wanted to build a fire, but there wasn't enough dry wood, and the small amount we found was damp from recent rain. We'd have to go without. We filled our water containers, using purification tablets, even though we were both so thirsty we wanted to drink straight from the source. We ate some trail mix and beef jerky in silence, both of us constantly looking over our shoulders, scanning the tree line. As darkness fell completely, the forest came alive with sounds, but normal sounds. Crickets, frogs from somewhere nearby, the occasional owl. It was almost reassuring, like maybe whatever had been there earlier had moved on. We laid out our sleeping bags side by side. No tent. We'd opted to go ultralight with just ground tarps and sleeping bags since the weather forecast had been clear, another decision I regretted. "I'll take first watch," I told Tommy. "Try to get some sleep." "Like that's gonna happen," he muttered, but he got into his sleeping bag anyway. The hours crawled by. I sat with my back against a tree, hatchet in one hand, flashlight in the other. I tried not to use the light too much, partly to conserve batteries, partly because I was afraid of what I might see if I shined it into the darkness beyond our little camp. Around midnight, I woke Tommy for his shift. I was exhausted, eyes burning from straining to see in the darkness. "Anything?" he asked. "No, just regular forest noises." I didn't tell him about the feeling I'd had around 11, a sensation of something large moving just beyond the range of my hearing. Nothing concrete, just a heaviness in the air, a subtle shifting of energy. I got into my sleeping bag but couldn't relax. Every snap of a twig had me wide awake. I kept my hand on the hunting knife beside me for all the good it would do. Sometime during Tommy's watch, it must have been around 3 in the morning, the forest went completely silent again. 1 minute, crickets and frogs, the next, nothing. I sat up immediately. Tommy was already on his feet. "You hear that?" he whispered. "I don't hear anything," I said. "That's the problem." We stood back to back, straining to listen. The silence was absolute, pressing against my eardrums like a physical thing. Then we heard it. A deep, rhythmic sound from somewhere up the slope. At first I thought it was my own heartbeat, but it was too slow, too deliberate. Thump, thump, thump. "Is that breathing?" Tommy's voice was barely audible. It wasn't breathing. It was footsteps. Heavy, measured footsteps moving parallel to our position, not coming closer but not moving away either. Just pacing along the slope about 50 yards above us, we stood frozen, hardly daring to breathe. The footsteps continued for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few minutes. Then they stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the footsteps. I strained to hear anything, breathing, movement, anything that would tell me where it was. But there was nothing. Tommy's hand found my arm, his fingers digging in hard enough to bruise. I followed his gaze upslope. There, just at the edge of the tree line, was a patch of darkness deeper than the night around it. A massive silhouette, perfectly still, watching. I couldn't make out features, just an enormous shape, at least 8 feet tall, maybe taller. We stood like that, locked in a silent standoff for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. Neither of us dared move or speak. I remember thinking, absurdly, that I should shine my flashlight at it, but my body wouldn't respond to the command. I was literally paralyzed with fear. Eventually, the shape moved, turning sideways with deliberate slowness. It made no effort to conceal its movement, a clear message that it was choosing to leave, not being driven away. In 2 massive strides, it disappeared into the forest. The instant it was gone, sound rushed back into the world. Crickets, frogs, the soft rustle of wind through trees. It was as if someone had suddenly turned the volume back up. Tommy and I looked at each other, both pale and shaking. "We're leaving," I said. "Right now." We didn't even pack properly. We stuffed our sleeping bags into our packs, grabbed our most essential gear, and left the rest. I didn't care about the expensive camping equipment we were abandoning. I just wanted out. We hiked by flashlight, stumbling and sliding down the trail. Twice I fell, once hard enough to bloody my knee, but I barely felt it. We didn't stop to rest or check the map. We just kept moving downhill, figuring we'd eventually hit a road or stream we could follow out. As dawn broke, we finally reached a logging road, not the one we'd come in on, but clearly one that had seen recent use. We followed it for nearly 3 hours before a Forest Service truck found us. The ranger was shocked to see hikers out there, said we were miles from any official trail. When he asked what we were doing in that area, all I could say was that we got lost. He drove us back to our truck. We thanked him and got the hell out of Trinity County as fast as that old Ford would take us. Tommy and I barely spoke about it afterward. When our parents asked about the trip, we just said we got lost and decided to cut it short. We never went backpacking together again. To this day, I've never returned to Trinity County. I've done a lot of hiking and camping since then, but always in established areas, always with groups. I don't go into the deep backcountry anymore. I know what's out there. Story 7. I never thought I'd actually share this, but it's been eating away at me, and I need to get it off my chest. Maybe someone here has experienced something similar or can help me make sense of what happened. I'm a wildlife photographer, nothing famous, just a passionate hobbyist who occasionally sells prints to local galleries. Last October, I rented this small cabin in the forests south of Blackwater Creek for a week-long photography trip. The autumn colors were just starting to peak, and I was excited to document the seasonal transition. The cabin was pretty basic, but had everything I needed: a bed, small kitchen, bathroom, and best of all, complete solitude. The first couple days were honestly perfect. I'd wake up early, catch the morning light filtering through the trees, spend hours hiking the surrounding trails, and then return to edit photos and plan the next day's shoots. The forest was alive with activity: deer, foxes, all kinds of birds. I even spotted a black bear from a safe distance on my second day. Everything changed on the third day. I'd spent the afternoon following a stream about 2 miles from the cabin, photographing the reflections of yellow and orange leaves on the water. By the time I headed back, the sun was getting low. As I approached my cabin, something felt different. At first, I couldn't put my finger on what was wrong, but then I noticed the small garden patch near the cabin had been disturbed. The soil was turned over in places, and some of the herbs the property owner had planted were uprooted. More concerning was my food supply. I'd stored some non-perishables in a bear-proof container outside, as recommended by the rental guidelines. The container was still closed and locked, but it had been moved several feet from where I'd left it, and when I opened it, about half my food was missing. The container showed no signs of damage. It was as if someone had simply unlocked it, taken what they wanted, and locked it again. I figured it must have been a bear, though I couldn't understand how it had opened the container without damaging it. Still, I wasn't taking any chances. I moved all remaining food inside and made a mental note to be extra loud when moving around outside to avoid surprising any wildlife. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the cabin made me tense up. Around 2 in the morning, I finally dozed off, only to be startled awake by what sounded like heavy footsteps on the wooden porch. The sound was deliberate. Thump, 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 slow and measured, not like an animal scurrying around. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I lay frozen in bed, barely breathing. The footsteps continued around the perimeter of the cabin, and I heard what sounded like something dragging against the outer walls. Eventually, I worked up the courage to peek through the window near my bed. What I saw made my blood run cold. A massive silhouette moved past the window, far larger than any person. It was hunched over, but still tall enough that I could only see its torso through my window, not its head. The moonlight was dim, but I could make out a bulky frame, covered in what looked like dark fur or hair. It moved with a strange, rolling gait, almost like a person trying to walk quietly, but too heavy to succeed. I ducked back down immediately, praying it hadn't seen me. The footsteps continued for another minute or two, then faded away. I didn't sleep a wink the rest of the night, sitting up in bed with my back against the wall, clutching my cell phone, which of course had no signal this deep in the forest. When morning finally came, I waited until the sun was fully up before venturing outside. What I found made me question everything I thought I knew about North American wildlife. There were footprints, if you could call them that, all around the cabin. They were enormous, nearly 16 inches long, with 5 distinct toes splayed out wider than any human foot. The impressions were deep in the soft earth, suggesting whatever made them was incredibly heavy. Even more disturbing were the handprints on my windows. Large, 5-fingered impressions in the dust and moisture, as if something had pressed its face against the glass to look inside. When I found them on the window directly above my bed, I nearly vomited. I should have left then. Any rational person would have. But I'm a photographer, and the part of my brain that wasn't consumed by fear was thinking about documentation. If this was some undiscovered species, I needed evidence, so I set up my motion-triggered cameras around the perimeter of the cabin, 4 of them positioned to cover all approaches. For 2 days, nothing unusual happened. The cameras captured deer, raccoons, and a fox, but nothing unexplained. I started to think maybe I'd overreacted. Maybe the footprints were from some large bear walking oddly, and my frightened mind had exaggerated their size and shape. Maybe the handprints were just smudges I was misinterpreting. On the 3rd night, my 6th at the cabin, a heavy rainfall woke me around midnight. I lay listening to the drops hammering the roof, almost peaceful when I heard it. A deliberate, powerful knocking on the cabin walls, not like branches blown by the wind. This was rhythmic. Knock, 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 pause, knock, knock, knock. Like a signal. It moved around the cabin, knocking in different places, sometimes so hard the whole structure seemed to vibrate. Then came the vocalizations, low, guttural sounds that started as something like a growl, but transformed into what I can only describe as words without language. It had cadence and inflection like speech, but in no language I've ever heard. The sound was deep enough that I felt it in my chest, even through the cabin walls. I spent the night huddled in the bathroom, the only room without windows, with the door locked, a chair propped under the handle, and my hunting knife clutched in my shaking hands. The sounds continued on and off until just before dawn, when everything went silent. When I finally emerged, the rain had stopped, and morning light filtered through the trees. I went straight to my cameras, hoping they'd captured whatever had been stalking around my cabin. Most showed nothing unusual. The rain had triggered some false recordings, and a few captured ordinary forest animals. But the camera pointing toward the densest part of the forest had caught something. At 3:27 in the morning, it recorded a partial image of something massive moving between the trees. The picture was blurry from the rain and only showed a section of what appeared to be a hair-covered limb and torso. Whatever it was, stood upright but was proportioned all wrong for a bear. The estimated height, based on the trees it stood between, was over 7 feet. That was it. I'd had enough. I spent the day frantically packing my equipment, constantly looking over my shoulder, jumping at every sound. The rational part of my brain tried to convince me it was just a bear, but bears don't knock on walls in patterns. They don't leave handprints on windows. They don't make sounds like attempted speech. As evening approached, I heard it again, crashing through the underbrush, moving toward the cabin from the forest. I threw the last of my gear into my car and got the hell out of there, tires spinning in the mud as I accelerated down the narrow access road. About half a mile from the cabin, I glanced in my rearview mirror and saw it. A tall, dark figure standing at the edge of the forest. It was partially obscured by trees, but I could make out broad shoulders, long arms, and what looked like a massive, somewhat pointed head. It stood completely still, watching me drive away. I never went back to that cabin. I sent the property owner an email with some excuse about a family emergency and left the key with a local business as arranged. I've looked at that photo from my camera hundreds of times, tried enhancing it, sent it to friends who are expert photo editors. No one can definitively say what it shows. I've done research since then, probably too much. I've gone down rabbit holes about unidentified forest creatures, read accounts of similar encounters. Some people in the Blackwater Creek area have reported strange experiences for decades, though most locals dismiss them as myths or exaggerations. I don't know what was in those woods. I don't know why it seemed so interested in me or my cabin. What I do know is that I've spent my entire life in nature, encountered nearly every large animal in North America, and nothing moves, sounds, or behaves like what I experienced during those terrifying nights. Sometimes I wonder if I should report it to someone, but who? Who would believe me? And what if they did believe me? What if they went looking for it and got hurt? Or worse? So I'm sharing it here, anonymously. Maybe someone else has seen it. Maybe someone knows what it is, or maybe writing this down will help me stop seeing that silhouette in my dreams, stop hearing those knocks when I'm alone at night, stop feeling like I'm being watched whenever I'm in the woods. I still take wildlife photos, but I don't go alone anymore, and I never, ever stay overnight. Story 8. I've debated for months whether to share this. Most people would probably think I'm making it up or that I just got spooked by a bear or something. But I know what I saw wasn't anything normal, and I still get nightmares about it. What happened to me last fall in the woods outside Hattiesburg changed me forever. I'm not some city kid who freaks out at every sound in the forest. I've been hunting since I was 12, and I've spent countless hours in those woods. My dad taught me everything about tracking, patience, and respecting nature. By 17, I was comfortable enough to hunt alone with my compound bow. It was early November, perfect bow hunting weather. The rut was starting, and I'd been tracking a big 8-pointer for weeks. That evening started like any other hunt. I got to my stand around 3 in the afternoon, climbing up about 15 feet into an old pine near a clearing where a trail cuts through the woods. It's a spot my dad and I had used for years. The first few hours passed uneventfully, just the usual forest sounds, squirrels rustling through fallen leaves, birds calling occasionally, the wind gently moving through the pine needles. I was wearing my dad's old camo jacket and pants, with an orange safety vest. My bow rested across my lap, and I had my backpack hanging from a hook on the stand with some water, beef jerky, and my phone, which I kept on silent. Around 6, as the sun was starting to set, and that golden hour light filtered through the trees, I heard the first unusual sound. Something was moving through the underbrush, maybe 200 yards away. At first, I thought nothing of it. Probably that buck I'd been tracking, or maybe a small group of doe. The footfalls seemed heavier than usual, but I figured it might be a big male. I adjusted my position slightly, making sure I was facing the right direction while staying as still as possible. My heart rate picked up a bit the way it always does when I think a deer is approaching. The excitement of the hunt, you know? Then I heard it. 3 deep, powerful grunts that echoed through the trees. My first thought was buck call. Males make grunting sounds during the rut to attract females. But these grunts, they weren't right. They were deeper, rougher, and way more powerful than any deer I'd ever heard. The sound vibrated in my chest even from that distance. I remember getting an immediate chill down my spine. It's hard to explain, but something in my gut just screamed that whatever made that sound wasn't natural. It wasn't a deer, wasn't a bear, wasn't anything I recognized. The sounds of movement got louder. Whatever it was getting closer to the clearing. I could hear branches snapping, not just small twigs, but actual branches breaking under serious weight. My excitement had turned completely to unease at this point. I found myself instinctively reaching for my hunting knife rather than readying my bow. The footsteps slowed as they approached the edge of the trail. Whatever it was had stopped just inside the tree line, maybe 40 yards from my position. I couldn't see it through the thick pines and underbrush, but I could feel it. It sounds crazy, but I swear I could sense it was aware of me too. For what felt like forever, but was probably only a minute or two, there was complete silence. No birds, no squirrels, nothing. Just the sound of my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. My palms were sweating despite the cool evening air. That's when I realized I wasn't hunting anymore. I was being hunted. I was trying to decide what to do, stay frozen in my stand or try to slowly get down and make a break for it. When it happened, the scream. God, that scream. I've heard bobcats and cougars before. I've heard injured animals and even a child screaming once when they broke their arm at a family picnic. It was like all of those sounds combined but cranked up to a volume that didn't seem possible. High-pitched yet incredibly powerful, it cut through the forest like a physical force. I actually flinched and nearly fell from my stand. At the same moment as the scream, the thing burst from the tree line. Even in the dimming light, I could see it clearly as it launched itself across the 20-foot-wide trail. It crossed the entire clearing in just 3 massive strides. 3, and it was upright. Not on 4 legs, but 2. It was huge, taller than a man by at least a couple feet, and thick through the chest and shoulders. The fading light and the speed of its movement meant I couldn't make out details of its face or exact coloring, but it was dark, maybe dark brown or black. What I remember most clearly was the way it moved, powerful, fast, but with a strange fluidity that didn't seem right for something so large. As it crashed into the trees on the other side of the path, it let out another one of those terrible screams. The sound of it tearing through the forest continued for maybe 30 seconds, snapping branches, crushing underbrush, and those ungodly screams fading as it moved away. I don't remember climbing down from my stand. I just remember running. I abandoned my bow, just grabbed my backpack and knife and ran like hell through the darkening forest. I knew the way home by heart, which was lucky because I wasn't thinking clearly. I was just running, branches whipping my face, nearly tripping over roots several times. The whole time I ran, I kept expecting to hear those footsteps behind me, to feel something grab me from behind. My lungs were burning, and I could taste blood in my mouth from breathing so hard through my nose and throat. I'm not ashamed to admit I was crying, not sobbing, but tears were definitely streaming down my face from pure terror. When I finally broke out of the tree line near our property, I nearly collapsed from relief. But my parents' car wasn't in the driveway. They were at some dinner with friends that night. I couldn't face being alone, so I ran next door to Mr. Peterson's house. I must have looked a complete mess when he opened the door, sweating, dirty, wild-eyed. He pulled me inside and sat me down at his kitchen table while I tried to explain what happened between gasps for air. While I was sitting there, we both heard it, distant but unmistakable, more of those screams and the sound of trees cracking. Mr. Peterson went pale. He's lived beside those woods for 40 years, and he said he'd never heard anything like it. "That ain't no animal I know," he said, pouring me a glass of water with slightly shaking hands. I stayed at his place until my parents got home. I told them what happened, but I could tell they thought I was exaggerating or had gotten spooked by a bear. Dad went with me the next day to retrieve my bow. I didn't want to go, but I couldn't let a $500 bow just sit out there. The whole time in the woods, I felt watched. Dad didn't say much, but he seemed on edge too. When we got to my stand, the bow was gone. Not fallen on the ground, not moved a little, completely gone. Dad looked around for a while, but eventually just shrugged and said someone must have found it and taken it, but there was something else he noticed that he couldn't explain away. Several of the smaller trees near the path were broken about 7 or 8 feet up, snapped clean, like something large had pushed through them. The breaks were fresh. It's been months now, and I still don't know what I encountered that day. I've researched everything from bears to panthers to wild hogs, but nothing matches what I saw and heard. I've read about Bigfoot sightings in the South, but I've always been skeptical of that stuff. Now, I don't know what to believe. I've been back in those woods since then. I can't let fear control me completely, but never alone and never at dusk. I carry a gun now instead of a bow when I hunt, and I never ever stay out once the sun starts setting. Sometimes at night, when I'm trying to fall asleep, I hear that scream again in my head. I see that massive shape launching across the clearing in 3 impossible strides. And I wonder, what if it had decided to come toward my stand instead of running away? What if it comes back? I still hunt, but not in that part of the forest. Some places just don't feel right anymore. Something was in those woods that wasn't supposed to be there. Something that doesn't fit into what we think we know about the natural world. And the worst part, I think it knew I was there. It knew, and it wanted me to know it was there too. This all happened 8 months ago, and I haven't told many people the full story. Most folks around here would think I'm crazy or making it up for attention, but I know what I experienced. I just wish I could explain it. Story 9. I never thought I'd be sharing this, but after keeping it bottled up for so many years, I need to get it off my chest. I've been lurking here for months, reading other people's experiences, and finally worked up the courage to write about what happened to me back in 1983. I was 17 then, living with my parents and younger sister on our family farm in northern Arkansas, about 100 acres that my great-grandfather had bought after the Civil War. Most folks around here had modest properties, but ours was considered large. We had apple and peach orchards on the eastern side, and the rest was a mix of open fields and dense forest, mostly pine with patches of oak, hickory, and maple. That summer was particularly hot, and the deer population had exploded. Game wardens were practically begging people to hunt, even issuing special permits outside regular season to thin the herds. My dad and I were avid hunters, so we were happy to help. We'd been tracking deer movements for weeks, setting up blinds and checking game trails. It was early June when I first noticed something weird. I was checking a trail we'd cleared years ago that cut through the western pine forest. About a quarter-mile in, I found 3 saplings, each about 5 or 6 inches thick, deliberately placed across the path. At first, I figured it was just kids from nearby farms messing around, though it seemed like a lot of work for a prank. The trees hadn't fallen naturally. They'd been pulled out of the ground from somewhere else and positioned there, roots and all. I cleared them away and didn't think much of it until a week later when I found the same thing on a different trail, this time with 5 trees. Some were too heavy for me to move alone, and I had to drag them off with our tractor. I remember being annoyed, thinking someone was trying to keep us off our own land. When I told my dad, he was puzzled, but suggested maybe the Hendersons, our neighbors to the north, were having issues with trespassers and were blocking access points. But that didn't make sense because the blockages were well within our property line. Things escalated about mid-June. Old man Whitaker, who owned the blueberry farm that bordered our property to the west, came by looking furious. His entire western field had been stripped overnight, hundreds of pounds of blueberries gone. He accused us of letting our cattle loose, but we hadn't kept cattle in years. Whatever took those berries didn't leave typical animal damage either. The bushes weren't trampled or broken, just methodically picked clean. A few days later, it happened to his eastern field too. And the weird part? All around both fields, we found more of those deliberate tree blockages, like something was trying to keep people away while it harvested. The incident that still makes my skin crawl happened on June 23rd. I remember the date clearly because it was my sister's birthday, and we'd planned a family cookout. I'd gone out early that morning to hunt, heading to the densest part of our property, an old logging cut about half a mile from Whitaker's farm that had regrown into a tangled mess of young trees and underbrush. I was tracking a large buck we'd spotted the previous evening when I came across something that stopped me cold. In a small clearing, trees had been bent and woven together to form what I can only describe as a structure. It wasn't random or accidental. Saplings had been pulled down from 15 feet up and deliberately intertwined with others to create an arch-like formation. It reminded me of a chapel or primitive shelter, maybe 8 feet tall at its peak and about 12 feet in diameter. The hair on my arm stood up because whatever built this had to be incredibly strong. These weren't twigs. Some of the trees were 4 inches thick and had been bent like they were nothing. The doorway faced east toward the rising sun, and inside was a bed of fresh pine needles arranged too neatly to be natural. I stood there frozen, my rifle hanging uselessly at my side. This wasn't teenagers or neighbors. This wasn't any animal I knew. This was deliberate, intelligent construction hidden deep in our woods where nobody had any reason to go. I backed away slowly and practically ran back to the house. I didn't tell anyone, not even my dad. It sounded crazy, and I didn't want to scare my sister on her birthday. I convinced myself there must be some explanation, though I couldn't figure out what. That evening after the party, I was helping clean up when we heard an unusual sound from the direction of our orchard. Something between a whistle and a howl, but not quite like a coyote or wolf. Dad grabbed his shotgun from above the fireplace, and I followed him outside. It was almost dark, with just enough light to see the outline of the trees. Probably just a fox, Dad said, but he didn't sound convinced. We walked toward the orchard, and the smell hit me first. A powerful, musky odor like wet dog mixed with skunk and something rotting. Dad smelled it too and frowned. Maybe a bear got into something dead, he suggested, but bears weren't common in our area. As we approached the first row of apple trees, we found dozens of green apples scattered on the ground. It was too early in the season for them to fall naturally, and they'd been pulled off the trees with single bites taken out of each one before being discarded. That's when we heard heavy movement through the underbrush at the edge of the orchard. Not small like a raccoon or possum, but big and deliberate. Dad raised his shotgun, and I instinctively stepped behind him. "Hello?" he called out. "This is private property." The rustling stopped immediately, like whatever it was understood him and was being deliberately quiet. We stood there for what felt like forever, listening to nothing but crickets and our own breathing. Then a rock, not a small pebble but a chunk of limestone the size of my fist, came sailing out of the darkness and landed about 10 feet to our left. It hadn't rolled down from anywhere. It had been thrown in a perfect arc. Dad fired a warning shot into the air, and we heard crashing through the woods, heavy, fast movement heading away from us. I wanted to go back to the house immediately, but Dad insisted on checking the perimeter of the orchard. At the far edge, where the fruit trees met the forest, we found something that made my blood run cold. A line of footprints in the soft earth of a recently plowed field. Not human prints. These were huge, easily 16 inches long and very wide, with 5 distinct toe impressions. There were 9 of them in a straight line, each about 7 feet apart, 7 feet between strides. Whatever made them had been running. Dad stood there looking at those prints, For a long time, his face unreadable in the fading light. Finally, he just said, "We're not talking about this to your mother or sister. No sense worrying them." I nodded, but I couldn't sleep that night. I kept thinking about that structure in the woods, the systematically blocked trails, the blueberries, and now these impossible footprints. The next morning, I went alone to check a small spring in the forest, where we sometimes set up hunting blinds during dry seasons. Around the muddy edges of the spring were more of those same footprints, and nearby was a rock that had clearly been thrown against a tree. The fresh impact mark and the rock's position made that obvious. As I crouched to examine the prints, I felt like I was being watched. The forest had gone quiet, no birds, no squirrels, nothing. Just silence, and that same musky smell from the previous night. Fainter, but definitely there. I raised my eyes slowly to scan the tree line and caught a glimpse of something moving behind a large oak about 50 yards away. Just for a second, a dark shape much taller than a man, with reddish-brown hair or fur. Then it was gone, moving with surprising speed and silence for its size. I didn't run. I couldn't. I was rooted to the spot with a fear I'd never felt before or since. This wasn't fear of the unknown. It was the sudden, terrible certainty that I did know what was out there, and that everything I'd been taught about what existed in these woods was wrong. Eventually, I backed away and returned home. I helped my dad put extra locks on our doors and windows that afternoon. We never directly discussed what we'd seen, but there was an unspoken understanding between us. The activity continued through the summer. More tree structures, more stolen fruit, occasional rock throwing. We started keeping our dogs in at night after one disappeared. The Whitakers eventually abandoned their blueberry farm, unable to sustain the constant losses. By fall, things had quieted down. Maybe whatever it was had moved on, or maybe it was just less active in cooler weather. I left for college the next year and only returned for holidays. It was years later, in my 30s, when I first read about similar incidents in other remote areas. The tree structures, territorial markers, rock throwing, all attributed to something most people mock as a myth or legend. Our farm was sold after my parents passed. I've never gone back, and I've never told this story until now. I know how it sounds, and I don't expect anyone to believe me, but I know what I saw, what I experienced. Something intelligent was living in our woods, something strong enough to bend trees and smart enough to create structures. Sometimes I wonder if it's still there, watching the new owners from the tree line, throwing rocks when they venture too far into what it considers its territory. I wonder if they've found any footprints or tree structures, or if they've dismissed them as pranks or natural occurrences like most people would. All I know is that for one summer, I learned our 100 acres weren't really ours at all. We were just unwelcome guests on land that something else considered home. Story 10. I still don't know how to process what happened that morning. It's been nearly 9 years, and I've told this story maybe 3 times total, always met with disbelief or uncomfortable laughter. So I guess I'm putting it down here because I need someone to just listen without immediately trying to explain it away. It was April 27th, 2014. The date is burned into my memory because it changed how I see the world. My brother-in-law Marcus and I had planned a morning hunt in Boone County, Missouri. We're both early risers anyway, but hunting gives us an excuse to be up before the sun. We left my place around 5:45 that morning. I remember checking my watch as we loaded the truck because I was worried we were running late. Spring turkey season was in full swing, and we wanted to get to our spot with plenty of time to set up before sunrise. The weather had been crazy that month. Lots of rain, which had swollen the Missouri River well beyond its normal banks. We were driving south on River Road in my old Ford F-150. It was about 6:30 in the morning, still pretty dark, but starting to get that pre-dawn grayness where you can just make things out. The headlights were cutting through a light fog that had settled over the bottomlands. The river was maybe only 5 yards from the edge of the road in some spots, which was unusual. Normally, there'd be a good 30 to 40 yards of floodplain between the road and the water. Marcus was half asleep in the passenger seat. I remember he had a thermos of coffee balanced on his knee and was sort of nodding off, then jerking awake every few minutes. We'd been mostly quiet, just some small talk about where exactly we wanted to set up. The radio was playing low, some country station, but I wasn't really listening to it. I wasn't driving fast, maybe 35 miles per hour. The road was wet from overnight rain, and with the river so close, I didn't want to risk hydroplaning. Plus, you always have to watch for deer around there, especially in the early morning. Then it happened. About 30 yards ahead of us, something massive emerged from the riverside. At first, in that split second, my brain tried to categorize it as a deer or maybe an elk, though I knew there weren't elk in that area. But immediately, I knew this was something else entirely. It was big, really big, and black, not brown like a bear, but a deep, wet black. The headlights caught it as it was moving, and I could see water glistening off its body. It looked completely soaked, like it had just come out of the river. I hit the brakes hard enough that Marcus's coffee spilled onto his pants. He cursed and started to complain, but then he saw it too, and just went completely silent. The thing, and I still struggle with what to call it, jumped across the entire width of the road in front of us. But it wasn't how it jumped that was so strange. It was how it moved. It launched itself from a crouched position on just one leg, keeping the other leg behind it, like some kind of bizarre, powerful hop. But this wasn't some awkward movement. It was fluid and deliberate, showing incredible strength as it propelled itself up the hill on the opposite side of the road. We never saw its face straight on. It maintained a profile view the whole time, which lasted maybe 5 seconds total. But I got a decent look at its silhouette against the pre-dawn sky. Using the trees on the hillside as reference points, I'd estimate it stood about 8 feet tall, maybe taller. After it cleared the road, it disappeared into the wooded hillside. The truck had come to a complete stop by then. Neither of us said anything for what felt like forever. I could hear Marcus breathing hard next to me. My hands were still gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles were white. I finally managed to say, "Did you see that?" Marcus nodded slowly. "What the hell was that?" I turned on the high beams and pointed. "Look at the road." There were 2 wet spots on the otherwise dry pavement where the creature had landed during its leap across. Actual footprints, or whatever you'd call them, visible as dark patches on the asphalt. "That was a Sasquatch," I said. The word felt ridiculous coming out of my mouth. I'd never believed in that stuff. I'd always thought Bigfoot was just something drunk hunters made up or mistook for bears in bad lighting. Marcus shook his head. "No way. It had to be a deer. Or maybe a bear. A bear that jumps on one leg? 8 feet tall? Maybe it was a hunter in some weird gear," he suggested, but his voice was shaky. "Some guy in a ghillie suit or something. At 6:30 in the morning. In the river? Coming out soaking wet and jumping across the road like that?" We sat there debating for a few more minutes, but I could tell Marcus was trying to rationalize what we'd seen into something that fit into his understanding of the world. I don't blame him. I wanted to do the same thing, but I couldn't. Eventually, I put the truck back in drive, and we continued to our hunting spot. Neither of us had much enthusiasm left for the hunt, but we went through the motions anyway. We didn't see a single turkey that morning, but I don't think either of us was really looking. On the drive back, we passed the same spot. In daylight, there was nothing to see. The wet spots on the road had dried up. There were no tracks on either the riverbank or the hillside that we could spot from the truck. Marcus suggested we stop and look for footprints, but I refused. Something about the idea of getting out and searching for evidence of that thing made my skin crawl. Over lunch at a diner in Colombia, Marcus had convinced himself it was just a bear. "Black bears can stand on their hind legs," he insisted between bites of his burger. It was probably scared by our headlights and did something weird. I nodded and let him talk, but I knew what I saw. The way it moved wasn't like any animal I've ever encountered, and I've been hunting in those woods my entire life. Bears don't hop across roads on one leg with enough power to launch themselves uphill. They don't stand 8 feet tall with the proportions I saw, and they don't move with that kind of purpose. The thing that really gets me, even now, is how deliberate it all felt. This wasn't some animal startled by our approach. It didn't panic or rush. It moved with intention, like it knew exactly what it was doing and had done it many times before. Like crossing roads while humans approached was just something it dealt with occasionally. In the weeks after, I found myself going back to that spot alone. I'd park my truck at different times of day and just sit there watching the riverbank and the hillside. I never saw anything unusual again. I checked maps of the area, wondering where something that size could possibly live without being detected. The Missouri River connects to a lot of remote areas, and those wooded hills have plenty of caves and dense forest where something could potentially hide. I even reached out to a local group that investigates Bigfoot sightings, but I backed out of meeting them at the last minute. I was afraid they'd either think I was crazy or worse, they'd believe me and want to turn the sighting into some big deal. I didn't want my name associated with this. I've got a normal job, a family. Being the Bigfoot guy wasn't something I wanted. Marcus and I still hunt together, but we never go back to that spot near River Road. We've never talked about that morning again after the first few days. Sometimes I think he's convinced himself it didn't happen the way we saw it. People do that, reshape memories to fit what they believe is possible. But I can't forget it. I remember every detail. The way water glistened on its black body in my headlights. The impossible power in that single-legged leap. The silence of it. There was no sound except for our truck and the slight splash of water as it emerged from the riverside. Sometimes when I'm driving early in the morning and pass near any body of water, I get this feeling in my gut, this expectation that something is about to emerge from the water's edge. I find myself slowing down, eyes scanning the tree line. My wife has noticed and asked why I get so tense when we drive near rivers, especially at dawn or dusk. I just tell her I'm watching for deer. I don't know what we saw that morning. I don't know if it was what people call Bigfoot or Sasquatch, or if it was something else entirely. All I know is that it existed, at least in that moment, and it didn't care that we saw it. It went about its business like we were just another feature of the landscape to navigate around. And that's what haunts me the most. Not that there might be undiscovered creatures in our woods, but that they might be well aware of us, while we remain mostly oblivious to them. That morning showed me how little I actually know about the world I've lived in my entire life, and I can never go back to not knowing that. Story 11. I still can't believe what happened to us that day. It's been almost 5 years, and I still get chills thinking about it. My daughter and I were supposed to have a nice mother-daughter hike at Kenosha Pass in Colorado. We'd done this hike several times before, but August 12th, 2018 changed everything for us. I remember the weather being absolutely perfect that day. Not too hot, clear blue skies, just enough of a breeze to keep the mosquitoes away. My daughter had just turned 21, a few months earlier, and we were trying to spend more time together before she went back to college for her senior year. She'd been so busy with her summer internship that we hardly saw each other, so I suggested we take a day trip to hike the Twin Cones Trail. We arrived at the trailhead around 1 in the afternoon. The parking lot wasn't too crowded, which was nice for a Sunday. We packed light, just water, some trail mix, a couple of sandwiches, and the basics like sunscreen and a small first aid kit. I also had this little air horn I always carry when hiking. My brother gave it to me years ago, saying it was better than bear spray because you don't have to worry about wind direction. I'd never actually had to use it before. The hike up was completely normal. We stopped a few times to catch our breath and take some pictures. My daughter was telling me about her plans after graduation, and I was just enjoying having her to myself for a few hours without her face buried in her phone. We made it to the upper area. Around 3:30, had our sandwiches, and took some selfies with the amazing view behind us. We started heading back down around 4. The descent is usually easier than the climb, and we were in good spirits, talking about stopping for dinner on the way home. We were about halfway down when my daughter suddenly stopped walking. "Mom, did you hear that?" she asked, looking toward the tree line. I hadn't heard anything. "What was it?" "It sounded like knocking, like someone hitting a tree with something." I listened for a moment but didn't hear anything unusual, just birds and the wind in the trees. "Probably just a woodpecker," I said, trying to be rational. I've been hiking these mountains for over 20 years, and I know most of the normal sounds. My daughter didn't look convinced, but we kept walking. A few minutes later, I decided to lighten the mood by making a joke of it. I picked up a small rock and knocked it against a boulder a few times. "See? Just like that?" I asked, smiling at her. Then I tossed the rock into the brush beside the trail. That's when everything changed. Not even 30 seconds later, we heard it. 3 distinct, loud knocks coming from the tree line about 50 yards away. These weren't random, natural sounds. They were deliberate, powerful, and clearly a response to what I had just done. My daughter grabbed my arm. "Mum, what was that?" Before I could answer, we heard it again. Knock, 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 but from a different location, further up the slope. Whatever was making the sound had moved, and quickly. "Let's just keep walking," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I didn't want to scare her, but I was starting to feel uneasy myself. We picked up our pace, but we'd only gone about 20 yards when something whizzed past my head and crashed into a tree beside us. At first, I thought it was a pine cone or something blown by the wind, but when I looked down, I saw a rock about the size of a golf ball on the ground. "What the—" I started to say when another rock flew between us. "Mom!" my daughter cried out. She was starting to panic, and honestly, so was I. "It's okay," I lied. "Maybe it's just some kids playing a stupid prank." But deep down, I knew that wasn't right. We hadn't seen anyone else on this part of the trail, and the rocks were coming from deep in the woods, not from the trail itself. Another rock sailed past us, bigger this time, the size of my fist. This wasn't just random. Something was deliberately throwing rocks at us, and whatever it was, it had good aim. Then the smell hit us. I've smelled a lot of things in the wilderness, dead animals, bear scat, all sorts of unpleasant natural odors. But nothing like this. It was like rotting meat that had been sitting in the sun for days, mixed with wet dog fur and something else I can't even describe. It was so strong it made my eyes water. My daughter started gagging. "Mom, what is that?" she asked, covering her nose with her shirt. I didn't have an answer. The smell seemed to be everywhere, like it was clinging to us, and it was getting stronger. That's when my daughter completely lost it. She started crying and pulling on my arm. "Mom, we need to leave right now. Please, let's go." I was about to agree when something made me look toward the tree line where the knocking had come from. What I saw still haunts me. About 60 yards away, partially hidden among the trees, was a massive dark figure. It wasn't a bear. I've seen plenty of bears while hiking, and this was nothing like that. It was tall, at least 7 or 8 feet, standing upright on 2 legs. The shape was vaguely human, but wrong somehow. The proportions were off, with long arms that hung down past where knees would be. It was covered in what looked like dark hair or fur, and it was watching us. I couldn't make out facial features from that distance, but I could feel its eyes on me. I froze. I literally couldn't move. It was like my brain couldn't process what I was seeing, and my body just shut down. My daughter yanked my arm hard, breaking whatever trance I was in. "Mom, what are you looking at? Let's go!" I turned to her, my mouth dry. "Run," was all I could say. We took off down the trail as fast as we could. The path was rocky and uneven, and I was terrified one of us would twist an ankle. More rocks flew past us as we ran, one of them grazing my shoulder hard enough to leave a bruise that lasted for weeks. I fumbled in my pack as we ran and pulled out the air horn. When another rock landed right in front of us, I stopped just long enough to press the button. The sound was deafening in the quiet forest, and for a moment the rock throwing stopped. We kept running, and I used the horn again every time I heard movement in the trees near us. It seemed to help. Whatever was following us would back off a bit each time, but it never went away completely. We were about a quarter-mile from the trailhead when we heard it, a deep, resonant sound that I can only describe as a whoop. It wasn't an animal call I recognized, and it definitely wasn't human. It echoed through the trees, making it hard to tell exactly where it came from, but it sounded like it was about 50 yards behind us. My daughter was sobbing now, barely able to run. I put my arm around her waist and practically dragged her the rest of the way. When we finally reached the parking lot, it was almost 6:15 in the evening. The sun was starting to set, and there were only 2 other cars left besides ours. We jumped in the car, locked the doors, and I started the engine with shaking hands. As I backed out of the parking space, I looked toward the trailhead. There was nothing there, no massive figure, no signs of whatever had been terrorizing us, just the trees and the gathering shadows. I drove way too fast down that mountain road. My daughter was hyperventilating in the passenger seat, and I wasn't doing much better. We didn't speak for almost 20 minutes. What was there to say? What had we just experienced? When we finally calmed down enough to talk, we tried to make sense of it. I've been hiking in Colorado for decades. I know what bears look like, what elk sound like, how mountain lions behave. This wasn't any of those animals. The knocking, the rock throwing, that horrible smell, and that massive dark figure, none of it fits with normal wildlife behavior. And that sound, that whoop, I still hear it in my nightmares. The whole encounter lasted maybe 30 minutes, but it felt like hours. My daughter had bruises where I'd grabbed her arm, and I had a nasty bruise on my shoulder from the rock. Those were real. What happened to us was real. I reported the incident to the park rangers the next day. They were polite but skeptical. They suggested it might have been a bear, or maybe even other hikers playing a prank. But I know what I saw. My daughter refused to go hiking with me after that. She won't even go camping anymore. As for me, I still hike, but never alone, and never in that area again. I carry bear spray now, and a bigger air horn, and I'm always looking over my shoulder. I've spent countless hours researching similar encounters since then. I've found stories from all over the country, stories that sound eerily similar to what happened to us. Most people are afraid to share these experiences because they don't want to be ridiculed. I understand that fear all too well. I don't know what was on that mountain with us that day. I can't explain it, and part of me doesn't want to. But I know what I saw, what I smelled, what I heard. Something was there, something that doesn't fit into our normal understanding of wildlife. I still have the clothes I wore that day. They're in a plastic bag in my garage because I can't bring myself to throw them away, but I can't wear them either. Even after multiple washes, they still carry a faint trace of that smell. It's like a reminder that I didn't imagine it. Sometimes I lie awake at night wondering if it's still out there in those woods, if it's watching other hikers the way it watched us, if someone else will have to run for their lives the way we did. My daughter and I don't talk about that day much anymore. It's like an unspoken agreement between us. We know what happened, but discussing it just brings the fear back. Sometimes I catch her looking at the mountains in the distance with this expression of dread on her face, and I know she's thinking about it too. I'm not asking anyone to believe me. I'm just sharing what happened to us that August day in 2018 at Kenosha Pass. I don't have explanations, just an experience that changed the way I see the wilderness forever. Whatever was out there, it was intelligent enough to mimic and respond to us. It was strong enough to throw rocks with frightening accuracy, and it was bold enough to let itself be seen, if only for a moment. That's what scares me the most. It wanted us to know it was there, Story 12. I've debated for years whether to share this, but I need to get it off my chest. I'm not looking for validation or trying to convince anyone. I just need to tell someone what happened to me back in May of 1993. I was 32 then, living in Atlanta, but always escaping to the mountains whenever I could. That Friday started like any other fishing trip. Me, my buddy Rick, and 3 other friends from work drove up to Helen, Georgia for some trout fishing. I'd been fishing those streams since I was a kid, so I knew all the good spots. We parked at this little pull-off area about 7 miles north of Helen, where a service road meets the highway. It was early, maybe 7 in the morning, and the air had that clean mountain smell that you just can't find in the city. We hiked down to the river, a beautiful clear stream cutting through the Appalachians. The other guys wanted to set up at the first decent pool we found. Rick and I, though, we always liked to push further up, where fewer people went. That's where the bigger trout hide. "Hey, Logan," Rick said, looking at me over his coffee thermos. "Want to check out what's upstream? Might find better fishing?" I'm a big guy, 6'3", 290 pounds back then, but I've always been comfortable hiking. Rick was smaller but wiry strong, always up for an adventure. We told the others we'd be back in a few hours and started following the river upstream. About a mile in, we found this old, overgrown roadbed running parallel to the river. You could tell it hadn't been used in decades, trees growing through it, totally reclaimed by nature. But it made for easier walking than fighting through the brush along the riverbank. The morning was warming up nicely. I remember being in a great mood, pointing out different birds to Rick. We'd been walking maybe 45 minutes when we came to this deep gully cutting across our path. The roadbed just stopped at the edge, then continued on the other side about 15 feet away. You could tell there used to be a bridge there, probably washed out years ago in a flood. We stood there debating whether to try crossing or head back down to the river and find another way around. I was peering down into the gully, must have been a 20-foot drop to the bottom, when we heard this loud thud behind us. I nearly jumped out of my skin. We both spun around, and there, lying directly across the path we'd just walked minutes before, was this massive log. I'm not talking about a branch. This was a section of tree trunk at least 10 feet long and thick as a car tire. "What the hell?" Rick said, staring at it. "Did that just fall?" I looked up at the trees overhead, then at the slopes on either side of the roadbed. There was no place this log could have rolled from. The forest floor around it was undisturbed. It was as if someone had picked it up and placed it there while our backs were turned. "That wasn't there when we walked through," I said, feeling suddenly cold despite the May warmth. Rick nodded, looking uneasy. "No way we'd have missed that." Then we heard it, a rustling of leaves up on the ridge to our right. At first, I thought deer, maybe a bear. We both turned to look. I'll never forget what I saw next. Standing about 10 feet up the slope, partially hidden among the trees, was something impossible. At first glance, my brain tried to process it as a man, but it was far too big. It stood upright on 2 legs, but it had to be at least 9 feet tall, with shoulders 4 feet wide if they were an inch. Its body had this powerful, muscular look, like a bodybuilder but proportioned differently. The whole thing was covered in dark, shaggy hair, not fur exactly, but long hair, darkest on its back and slightly lighter on its chest and face. The face, God, the face. It was flat and wide, with a pronounced brow ridge, almost human-like, but not. Its nose was broad and flat, and its mouth seemed slightly protruding. But the eyes, those eyes are what haunt me. They were deep set under that heavy brow, reddish-brown in color, and they were looking right at us, not with the blank stare of an animal, but with intelligence, like it was evaluating us, thinking about what to do next. For what felt like forever, but was probably just seconds, none of us moved. I could hear Rick breathing next to me, fast and shallow. I couldn't even breathe. My mouth had gone completely dry. Then it shifted its weight, and that broke the spell. Rick grabbed my arm so hard it left bruises. "Run," he whispered, his voice cracking. We bolted. I've never run so fast in my life. We tore back down that old roadbed, leaping over roots and rocks, not even bothering to look if that thing was following us. I kept expecting to feel a hand grab me from behind, to be yanked backward. The thought made me run even faster. When we reached the spot where the log lay across the path, we had to slow down. I remember hesitating for just a split second. Should we go around it through the brush or try to climb over? Rick vaulted over it like an Olympic hurdler, and I followed, scraping my shin badly on the rough bark, but barely feeling it. We didn't stop running until we reached our friends. We burst into their clearing, gasping for breath, covered in sweat and scratches. They looked up from their fishing, startled. "Jesus, what happened to you two?" Dave asked, standing up. I couldn't even speak. I bent over, hands on my knees, trying to catch my breath. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. Rick, still panting, said, "You guys aren't going to believe this." Of course they didn't. They laughed, said we'd seen a bear, maybe spooked ourselves over nothing. Dave and Mike were the worst. They kept making jokes, asking if we'd been drinking already. "Fine," I said, finally finding my voice. "Come see for yourselves." Dave and Mike agreed to come back with us, not because they believed us, but because they thought it would be funny to prove us wrong. Rick refused to go. He just sat down by the river, hands still shaking, and said, "No way in hell." I don't blame him. Part of me wanted to stay too, but I needed those guys to see what we'd seen, to validate that I wasn't crazy. The walk back seemed to take forever. I felt exposed the whole time, constantly scanning the trees around us. Dave and Mike kept up a steady stream of jokes, but I barely heard them. All I could think about was those eyes watching us. When we reached the log across the path, they stopped laughing. "Okay, that is weird," Dave admitted, examining how the log lay perfectly perpendicular to the trail. "But still doesn't mean Bigfoot put it there." We continued cautiously to the gully. I didn't want to go further, but I had to show them where we'd seen it. The creature was gone, of course. Part of me was relieved, part disappointed. Without seeing it themselves, I knew they'd never believe us. "Let's check the ground," I suggested. "Maybe it left tracks." We spread out, searching the area. I headed down toward the riverbank, where the soil was softer. That's where I found it. A footprint in the mud near the water's edge. I called the others over. It was unmistakably a foot, but enormous, 18 inches long at least, with 5 distinct toes. The impression was deep, suggesting whatever made it was incredibly heavy. Dave stared at it, his skepticism finally shaken. That's not human. And it's not a bear," I added. "Bears don't have feet like this." Mike tried to argue it could be a hoax. But out here, miles from any road, in a spot few people ever visited, it made no sense. We took some measurements using Dave's fishing knife for scale, but none of us had a camera. This was 1993, no cell phones with cameras, and none of us had thought to bring a camera fishing. We searched for more prints but found nothing conclusive. The ground was too dry and rocky in most places. Eventually, we headed back to rejoin the others. The mood completely changed. No one was joking anymore. Fishing was forgotten that day. We packed up early and left, all of us quiet on the drive back to Atlanta. I couldn't stop thinking about that creature, about the deliberate way it had placed that log behind us, cutting off our escape route. It had been intelligent enough to strategize, to try to trap us. The thought still sends shivers down my spine. In the years since, I've gone back to those mountains many times, but never alone, and never to that exact spot. I've experienced other strange things up there. Wood knocking sounds that echo through the valleys, weird vocalizations that don't match any known animal, rocks thrown from the woods when no one else is around. I've read everything I can find about Bigfoot encounters. So many details match what Rick and I experienced. The strategic placement of objects, the intelligent behavior, the physical description. I know what we saw wasn't a bear, wasn't a man in a suit, wasn't a misidentified known animal. That day changed my relationship with the forest forever. Before, I'd always felt at home in the woods. Now I can't shake the feeling of being watched. Every snapped twig, every rustle in the underbrush makes me freeze. Rick moved to Colorado the following year. We don't talk about what happened much, but when we do get together, there's this unspoken understanding between us. We know what we saw, even if we can't explain it. I still love fishing those mountain streams, but I never stay past sunset anymore, and I always carry bear spray, though I doubt it would do much good against what we encountered. Sometimes when I'm up there, I'll find myself scanning the ridgelines, half expecting to see that massive silhouette watching me from the trees. Whatever it was we saw that day, it was intelligent, it was powerful, and it had us completely at its mercy, but it let us go. That's the part that keeps me awake some nights. Why did it reveal itself to us? Why place that log to trap us, then not follow through? I don't have answers. All I know is what I saw with my own eyes. Something impossible exists in those Georgia mountains. Something that shouldn't be real, but is. And once you've seen it, you can never unsee it or forget the moment your understanding of the world changed forever. Story 13. I'm still not sure if I should even be writing this down. For 24 years, I've mostly kept this to myself, only telling a handful of people who usually give me that look. You know the one, where they're trying to decide if you're crazy or just making stuff up for attention. But what happened that night in Newcastle has never left me, and sometimes I wonder if anyone else from my hometown remembers it too. It was the summer of '99, late July. I was 16, spending the night at my best friend Kayla's house, which was just one street over from mine. Her parents were pretty chill and let us stay up late watching whatever we wanted. That night, we were marathoning these cheesy horror movies on cable, the kind that are more funny than scary. We had all the lights off except for this small lamp in the corner, and we'd gone through 2 bags of microwave popcorn and way too many sodas. It must have been close to midnight when it happened. The movie had just gotten to this really dumb part where the killer was chasing some girl through the woods, and we were laughing about how she kept tripping over nothing. Then we heard it, dogs barking, and not just like normal nighttime barking when a raccoon gets into someone's trash. This was different, frantic, aggressive, like multiple dogs all losing their minds at once. At first we tried to ignore it, but the barking got louder, more urgent. It sounded like they were running, moving down the street. Kayla and I looked at each other, and I could tell she was thinking the same thing I was. Something was wrong. "Should we check it out?" I asked, already getting up from the couch. Kayla hesitated. "My parents will kill me if they wake up and we're outside this late." But curiosity got the better of us. We went to the front door and peeked out the window first. The street was quiet and dark, except for the yellowish glow of the street lamps spaced too far apart. The barking was getting closer. "I don't see anything," Kayla whispered. "Let's just step out on the porch for a second," I said. We opened the door as quietly as possible and stepped outside. The July night was warm and sticky, and immediately I felt goosebumps rise on my arms despite the heat. The barking was coming from around the corner, and it sounded like the dogs were running toward us. That's when we saw it. Under the dim streetlight about 100 feet away, a figure came tearing around the corner. My first thought was that it was a person, someone running from the dogs, but instantly I knew that wasn't right. This thing was moving way too fast, and it was massive. Like, not just tall, but broad and somehow wrong in its proportions. It passed under the street lamp for just a split second, but even in that brief moment of illumination, I couldn't make out clear details. It was like my brain couldn't process what I was seeing. Behind it came the dogs, 5 or 6 of them, all different sizes, barking and snarling. I'd never seen dogs behave like that. They weren't attacking, they were chasing, as if trying to drive the thing away. Then it screamed. God, that sound. 24 years later, and I still get cold all over when I think about it. It wasn't human. It wasn't animal. It was something else entirely. The closest thing I can compare it to is maybe the sound of metal grinding against metal, mixed with a woman's scream, but deeper, more guttural, and with this weird echoing quality like it was coming from inside a cave. It felt wrong, like the sound itself was violating some natural law. Kayla grabbed my arm so hard her nails dug into my skin. I didn't even feel it until later when I noticed the little half-moon marks. "What the fuck is that?" she whispered, her voice shaking. I couldn't answer. My throat had closed up completely. The figure kept running, faster than anything I'd ever seen move on two legs. It disappeared down the street with the pack of dogs still in pursuit, their barking fading into the distance. The whole thing probably lasted less than 30 seconds, but it felt like time had stretched out. We stood frozen on the porch for what seemed like forever. Neither of us wanted to be the first to suggest going back inside, as if acknowledging what had just happened would somehow make it more real. Finally, Kayla pulled me back into the house and locked the door. We checked all the windows, making sure they were locked too. The movie was still playing, but we turned it off. Suddenly, fictional horror didn't seem entertaining anymore. "Did you see its face?" Kayla asked, her voice barely audible. I shook my head. "Not clearly. Did you?" "No, but it was big, Liv. Like, really big." "I know." My voice sounded strange to my own ears. We tried to convince ourselves it was just some drunk guy, maybe someone in a costume playing a prank. But we both knew better. No costume could move like that. No person could make that sound. We stayed up the rest of the night, talking in whispers, jumping at every creak of the house settling. Neither of us wanted to sleep. When the first light of dawn came through the windows, I felt this overwhelming relief. Whatever had happened, at least we'd made it through the night. I left Kayla's house early, around 7 in the morning. Her parents were still asleep, and I told her I'd call her later. The walk home was only about 5 minutes, but I ran the whole way, constantly looking over my shoulder. When I got home, my mum was in the kitchen making coffee. She looked tired, with dark circles under her eyes. The moment she saw me, she asked, "Did you hear those screams last night?" My stomach dropped. "What screams?" "Around midnight, the most awful sound I've ever heard. It woke up the whole house." She shivered, wrapping her hands around her coffee mug. "Max was going crazy." Max was our German shepherd, normally the bravest dog you'd ever meet. He'd once chased off a guy trying to break into our neighbor's car and regularly barked at anyone who came too close to our property. "Where is he?" I asked. "Still under my bed. Won't come out. I've never seen him like this." I went to my parents' bedroom and got down on my hands and knees. Sure enough, Max was pressed against the wall under the bed, his eyes wide, trembling slightly. When he saw me, he whimpered but didn't move. "Come on, boy," I coaxed, patting the floor. "It's okay now." He wouldn't budge. My 10-year-old sister Lily was still in her room with the door closed. When I knocked, she called out, "Who is it?" in this tiny, scared voice I'd never heard from her before. "It's me, Liv." She opened the door just a crack, peering out. "Is it gone?" "Is what gone?" "The monster." She said it so matter-of-factly, like she was asking about the weather. A chill ran through me. "What monster, Lil?" "The one that was screaming. I saw its shadow on my wall." Her voice dropped to a whisper. It was really tall. Lily's bedroom was on the second floor, facing the side yard. If she saw a shadow on her wall, something had to have been right outside our house. I told her everything was fine now, that it was probably just some animal. But she didn't believe me. She wouldn't leave her room for most of the day. After breakfast, I went outside, telling my mom I was going to check the mail. Instead, I walked around to the side of the house, to the area below Lily's window. The ground there was mostly dirt and patchy grass, and it had rained a bit 2 nights before, so the soil was still slightly damp. That's when I saw them. Footprints. Massive, bare footprints pressed deep into the mud. They were easily twice the size of my dad's feet, and he wore a size 12. The stride length between them was huge, like whatever made them had been taking enormous steps or running. I followed the tracks to where they disappeared into the harder ground near our driveway. They were heading toward the railroad tracks that ran behind our neighborhood, cutting through a stretch of woods at the edge of town. Those tracks had always given me the creeps, even before this happened. They created this perfect corridor through the outskirts of Newcastle, connecting patches of woodland and passing behind houses where no one would notice something moving at night. I'd often thought they'd be the perfect route for someone who didn't want to be seen, or something. I tried to show the footprints to my mom, but by the time I convinced her to come outside, the sun had dried the ground enough that they weren't as clear. She said they were probably just from the meter reader who sometimes cut through our yard. But the meter reader wore boots, not bare feet, and he definitely didn't have feet the size of dinner plates. Later that day, I called Kayla. Her mom answered and said she was still sleeping, which was weird because Kayla never slept past noon, even after staying up all night. When she finally called me back that evening, her voice sounded distant, detached. "My parents think we imagined it," she said, "or that we fell asleep watching the movie and had the same nightmare." "You know that's not what happened," I said. "I know." There was a long pause. "But maybe it's easier if we just don't talk about it." And so we didn't. Not really. Sometimes we'd make vague references to that night, but we never discussed the details again. It was like we both silently agreed that acknowledging it would make it too real, too terrifying to process. In the weeks that followed, I kept waiting to hear news reports about a strange creature sighted in Newcastle, or at least some mention of the unearthly screaming that had echoed through our neighborhood. But there was nothing. Life just went on like normal. Max eventually came out from under the bed, but he was never quite the same. He'd growl at nothing, staring intently at the woods behind our house. He refused to go out at night, even with someone accompanying him. My mum would joke about how that night with the screaming had turned our brave guard dog into a scaredy cat, but I could tell it bothered her too. The strangest part of the whole thing was the dogs. Where had they come from? We knew most of the dogs in our neighborhood, and none of them roamed free at night. These had appeared out of nowhere, seemingly united in their pursuit, despite being different breeds and sizes. They were as disturbed by whatever that thing was as we were. I've spent years trying to rationalize what Kayla and I saw. Maybe it was just a very tall person. Maybe the darkness and the streetlights played tricks on our eyes. Maybe the scream was just some kind of machinery or a car with bad brakes. But deep down, I know better. I know that whatever ran through Newcastle that July night in '99 wasn't human. It was something else, something that didn't belong in our world, something that left footprints too large to be human and made sounds no human throat could produce. I moved away from Newcastle after college and rarely go back. My parents still live in the same house, and sometimes when I visit, my mum will bring up that night with the weird screaming and laugh about how Max hid under the bed. But there's always this look in her eyes, like she knows there was more to it than she's willing to admit. I've never stopped wondering what it was, where it came from, or where it was going. Was it just passing through, following the railroad tracks to somewhere else? Was it looking for food? Was it lost? I'll never know. All I know is that I heard it. I saw it. And 24 years later, I still check that my windows are locked at night, still flinch when I hear dogs barking in the distance, and still wake up sometimes with that inhuman scream echoing in my dreams. Story 14. I never thought I'd share this story with anyone outside my family. It's been over 60 years now, but what happened that day in 1962 still makes my skin crawl. I was only 34 then, my wife Sarah 32, and our daughter Lacey was 11. We were just an ordinary family from Arizona who enjoyed the outdoors. Kent Johnson, that's me, a telephone company technician who loved taking his family hunting. October 26th started like any other hunting day. We'd been at Greens Peak for 3 days already, about 30 miles, east of Springerville. Beautiful country, tall pines, crisp mountain air. We'd had decent luck too. I'd bagged a small buck the day before. This was supposed to be our last day out before heading home. That morning we packed up our small camp early. I remember Sarah saying she didn't want to drive home tired like last time when I nearly ran us off the road outside of Show Low. Practical as always, my Sarah. We'll head out by 3, be home for dinner, I told them, as we loaded the last of our gear into our Chevy station wagon. Lady, our Cocker Spaniel, seemed unusually restless that morning. She was normally so well behaved on our trips, but she kept pacing around the car, whining. "What's gotten into her?" Sarah asked, trying to settle Lady in the back seat. The dog wouldn't sit still, kept staring out the windows, her nose pressed against the glass. "Probably smells deer," I said, though something about her behavior felt off. Lady was a hunting dog, used to the scent of game. This was different, more agitated, almost panicky. Around noon, we were driving slowly along a dirt logging road when I spotted a small herd of deer grazing on a hillside about half a mile away. Perfect opportunity for one last hunt. "I'll go on foot from here," I told Sarah. "You take the car around to that clearing we passed about 2 miles back. I'll meet you there in an hour or so." Sarah nodded, sliding into the driver's seat. "Be careful, Kent." As I grabbed my rifle and checked my pockets for shells, Lady went absolutely wild in the back seat. She was scratching at the windows, barking, trying desperately to get out. I'd never seen her act like that before. "Keep her in the car," I told Sarah. "Something's got her spooked." "Maybe we should just go home," Sarah suggested, and I wished to God I'd listened to her. But I was stubborn back then. "One more try," I insisted. "I'll be quick." I kissed Sarah and Lacey goodbye and set off through the trees toward where I'd seen the deer. The forest was strangely quiet. No birds, no squirrels, just the sound of pine needles crunching under my boots. Looking back, that should have been my first real warning. What happened to me in the woods was uneventful compared to what Sarah and Lacey experienced. I tracked those deer for about 40 minutes before losing their trail completely. The whole time, I had this creeping sensation of being watched. Every few minutes I'd turn around, expecting to find someone standing behind me, but there was never anything there, just trees and shadows and that unnatural silence. After a while, I gave up and started making my way toward our meeting point. I was about half a mile away when I heard the first scream. It froze my blood. I still remember thinking it sounded like Lacey, but different, higher pitched, almost inhuman. I started running. But what really happened was with Sarah and Lacey. Sarah told me everything later, when we were safely home. They'd driven to the clearing like I'd asked, parked the car, and waited. Lady was still acting strange, whining and pacing in the back seat, her nose pressed against every window. After about 20 minutes, Lacey needed to use the bathroom. Sarah told her to go behind some bushes near the car, but Lady was so frantic to get out that Sarah decided to let her stretch her legs too. She put Lady on her leash and let Lacey take her out while she stayed by the car. The moment Lady's paws hit the dirt, she started pulling hard on the leash, nose to the ground, then up in the air, sniffing frantically. She was growling low in her throat, something she almost never did. Sarah noticed it then, the smell. She described it later as like wet garbage and something rotten. It was strong enough that she called out to Lacey to hurry up and get back in the car. "I thought it might be a bear, or maybe a mountain lion," Sarah told me, "or some animal with rabies. I just knew we needed to get back in the car." Lacey was trying to pull Lady back, but the dog was straining against the leash, growling at something in the thicket of trees about 30 yards from the clearing. Then it happened. The nylon leash snapped. Lady bolted into the trees, disappearing from sight. Sarah yelled for Lacey to get in the car while she ran after Lady. She could hear the dog barking furiously, then growling. Then came that scream, the one I heard from half a mile away. Sarah said it didn't sound like any animal she'd ever heard. Not a mountain lion, not a bear. It was too loud, too wrong. She was at the edge of the thicket when she saw movement in the trees. Lady appeared to be dragging something big. Sarah said it made no sense. Lady was only about 30 pounds, but whatever she was pulling seemed massive, at least the size of a full-grown man. The dog had her teeth sunk into what looked like dark, matted fur. Then Lady let go and collapsed, just dropped like her legs had given out. Sarah ran forward and scooped her up. The dog was limp but breathing. That's when Sarah noticed Lady's leash was tangled around what she thought was a fallen log. She didn't look too closely. She was focused on getting Lady and Lacey to safety. Sarah ran back to the car with Lady in her arms. Lacey was already inside, eyes wide with fear. Sarah jumped in, put Lady on the back seat, and that's when the first rock hit the hood of our Chevy. It wasn't a small rock, Kent, she told me later. It was the size of a bowling ball, and it dented the hood like it had been dropped from 20 feet up. Then another rock hit the roof, then another slammed into the windshield, cracking it from side to side. Sarah started the engine, but the rocks kept coming, big ones that left deep dents in the metal. They were coming from the direction of the thicket, but Sarah swore there was nobody there she could see, just the trees and shadows. She floored it, the station wagon fishtailing on the dirt road as she sped away from the clearing. Lacey was crying in the passenger seat, and Lady was still unconscious in the back. They'd gone about 100 yards when they saw me standing in the middle of the road. I remember the look of pure terror on Sarah's face as she slammed on the brakes. I jumped in, asking what the hell was happening, and that's when the final rock hit, right where I had been standing seconds before. It was massive, at least 50 pounds, and it would have killed me instantly. I didn't ask questions. I just took the wheel from Sarah and drove us out of there as fast as that station wagon would go. We were all shaking, even Lady, who had finally come around and was whimpering in the back seat. It wasn't until we were miles away, almost to the highway, that Sarah told me what had happened. I didn't believe her at first, about the rocks, about Lady dragging something too big for her to move. It seemed impossible, but the dents in our car were real. The cracked windshield was real, and Lady was different after that day. She wouldn't go outside alone, even in our fenced backyard. She slept pressed against our bedroom door every night until she died 3 years later. We never reported what happened. Who would believe us? Our dog fought something in the woods, and then invisible hands threw rocks at our car. They'd have thought we were crazy or drunk or both. I've spent decades trying to make sense of what happened that day. Was it some kind of territorial mountain man? A bizarre weather phenomenon? I've read about poltergeists, about unexplained phenomena in the wilderness, but nothing quite matches what we experienced. The strangest part came about a week later. I was cleaning out the car, trying to decide if it was worth fixing all the dents, when I found something caught in the undercarriage. It looked like dark, coarse hair, too thick for a deer, too long for a bear. I put it in a plastic bag, meaning to take it somewhere to be identified, but the bag disappeared from my workbench the next day. Sarah swore she hadn't touched it. We never went back to Greens Peak, never went hunting again, actually. Something about the wilderness stopped feeling welcoming after that day. Sometimes I wonder if whatever was out there is still there, waiting in the trees. Sometimes I wonder if Lady saved us from something far worse than a few flying rocks. I'm an old man now. Sarah passed 5 years ago, and Lacey lives out of state with her own family. I've never told this story to anyone outside our immediate family. Even now, my hands are shaking as I type this. Some experiences change you forever, mark you in ways you can't explain. That day at Greens Peak marked all of us. I still dream about it sometimes. The silence in the forest, the smell Sarah described, that inhuman scream. In my dreams, I always turn around just in time to see what's throwing the rocks. But I always wake up before I can make out what it is. Maybe that's a mercy. Some things I think we're not meant to understand. Some things are better left in the shadows of the pines, in the quiet places where people don't belong. I don't know what was in those woods that day in October of '62, but whatever it was, it knew we were there, and it wanted us gone. Story 15. I still get goosebumps telling this story. I've only shared it with a few close friends and my immediate family, but I need to get it off my chest. I'm not looking for attention or trying to convince anyone about what's out there in the woods around Tillamook. I know what I saw, twice now, and I can't explain it. The first time happened when I was 18. I was waiting at the bus stop with my younger sister Melissa after school got cancelled due to a power outage. It was mid-October, around 3 in the afternoon, but the sky was already getting that grayish tint it gets in Oregon during fall. We lived about 2 miles from the school, down this rural road that cuts through a dense section of forest. Our bus stop was basically just a small clearing with a wooden bench right where the school property ended and the tree line began. We'd been waiting maybe 15 minutes when I first noticed the smell. If you've ever driven past roadkill that's been sitting out for a few days in hot weather, it was like that but worse, like rotting meat mixed with something musky and foul. I remember looking at Melissa and seeing her nose wrinkle up. "What is that?" she asked, covering her nose with her sleeve. I figured maybe an animal had died nearby. It happens a lot out here. Deer get hit on the roads and drag themselves into the woods to die. But this smell was so strong it made my eyes water. That's when we heard the first grunt. It was low, coming from somewhere in the dense trees behind us, maybe 50 yards back. At first, I thought it might be a bear. We get black bears in the area sometimes, and they make these huffing sounds. But this was different. It was deeper, more deliberate. I grabbed Melissa's arm and pulled her closer to me on the bench. "Just stay quiet," I whispered. "It's probably just an animal passing through." We sat there for another few minutes, and then we heard it again, louder this time and closer. It wasn't just a grunt anymore. It was this guttural sound that seemed to vibrate the air around us. I can still hear it in my dreams sometimes, this low, rumbling growl that didn't sound like any animal I knew. "Ryan, I'm scared," Melissa whispered. She was 14 then, trying to act tough, but I could feel her trembling. "Let's just start walking home," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Stay on the road, don't run." We stood up slowly, and that's when we heard the crack, like a tree branch snapping, but not a small one. This sounded like something had broken a branch as thick as my arm. Then came the sound of movement in the underbrush, fast and heavy. Whatever was in there was big, and it was coming toward us. I don't remember making the decision to run. 1 second we were standing by the bench, and the next we were sprinting down the road toward home. I had Melissa's hand in mine, practically dragging her as she struggled to keep up. The thing is, we could hear it running parallel to us in the woods. It wasn't on the road. It was crashing through the trees, keeping pace with us easily even though we were running full out. The sounds it made while moving were all wrong, too heavy, too fast for anything that should be in those woods. We'd made it about a 1/4 mile down the road when I made the mistake of looking into the trees. That's when I saw it. It stepped out just enough for me to see its outline between 2 massive firs. It was huge, at least 7 or 8 feet tall, but hunched over at the shoulders like it was uncomfortable standing upright. Its face is what I remember most vividly. It wasn't exactly like a man's face or an ape's. It was something in between. Leathery skin stretched over prominent brow ridges, with a wide, flat nose with nostrils that seemed to flare as it breathed. Its eyes caught what little light there was, reflecting back at me for just a second. The rest of its body was covered in dark brown hair, not fur exactly, but more like a matted coat that covered a frame that was just massive. The shoulders alone must have been twice as wide as mine. For just a split second, it and I locked eyes. I felt something primal then, pure fear unlike anything I've ever experienced. My legs almost gave out. It was like every instinct in my body was screaming at me that I was looking at a predator, and I was prey. I yanked Melissa harder, and we ran faster than I thought possible. I could hear her crying as we ran, but neither of us stopped or looked back again. The thing kept pace with us in the woods for another half-mile before the sound started to fade. By the time we reached the field that bordered our property, we couldn't hear it anymore. We burst through the front door, startling our mom, who was in the kitchen. We were both hyperventilating, covered in sweat despite the cold weather. When she asked what happened, we tried to explain, but it came out as a jumbled mess about something chasing us. She thought we'd seen a bear or a cougar. Dad drove back to the bus stop later to look around, but found nothing except some broken branches and what he described as unusual tracks that had been partially washed away by the rain that had started after we got home. We didn't take the bus for weeks after that. Mum drove us to and from school until we finally convinced her we were okay. But I never waited at that bus stop alone again. I thought that was the end of it. I convinced myself that maybe it had been a bear, an unusually large one that just looked strange in the dim light and through the filter of my fear. For 4 years I managed to almost believe that. Then came the second encounter, and there's no way I can explain this one away. I was 22, home from college for Thanksgiving break. My grandmother lives about 20 miles outside of Tillamook, deeper into the forested areas. I was driving out to her place to help fix her generator before the family gathering the next day. It was around 5 in the evening, already dark, with a light fog settling into the valleys. The road to Grandma's is narrow and winding, with thick forest on both sides for most of the drive. There are stretches where you don't see another house or car for miles. I'd made the drive 100 times, so I wasn't worried even though visibility wasn't great. I had the radio on low, just humming along to some song, when I had to brake suddenly. There was something in the road ahead, visible in my headlights. At first, I thought it was a fallen tree, or maybe a large deer. But as I slowed down, I realized it was moving. I came to a complete stop about 30 feet away from it. That's when it stood up. This thing was even bigger than what I'd seen 4 years earlier. It had been crouched down, doing something in the middle of the road that I couldn't make out. When it rose to its full height, it had to be at least 8 or 9 feet tall. Its body was massive, not fat, but incredibly thick and solid looking. The shoulders were so broad they seemed disproportionate even to its height. This one was different from the first. Its hair was more grayish, especially around what I'd call its chest and face. It looked older somehow, heavier. Its head was broad, but came to a point at the top, similar to the way a gorilla's skull is shaped. I sat there, hands frozen on the steering wheel, engine idling. I couldn't move. I couldn't even reach for my phone to take a picture. All I could do was stare at it through my windshield as it stared back at me, and it did stare. It looked directly at me, meeting my eyes through the glass. There was intelligence there, I'm certain of it. Not animal curiosity, but a calculating awareness. It knew exactly what I was, and it was deciding what to do about me. For almost a minute we stayed like that, me in my car, it standing in the middle of the road. I could see its breath fogging in the cold air. I could see the way the muscles in its arms shifted as it slightly changed its posture. These details are burned into my memory. Then I made the mistake of glancing down to try to find my phone, just for a second. When I looked back up, it was gone. Not just moved to the side of the road, completely gone. I sat there for another few minutes, engine running, scanning the trees on both sides of the road. There was no movement, no sound. It had vanished into the forest without making a noise, which seemed impossible for something that size. I drove the rest of the way to my grandmother's with my doors locked and windows up, constantly checking my mirrors. I made it there safely, but I didn't tell anyone what I'd seen. How could I? "Hey, Grandma, I just saw Bigfoot on the way here. Isn't Exactly casual dinner conversation. On the drive back that night, I had my friend Jake ride with me. I made up some excuse about being tired and needing company for the drive. We didn't see anything unusual, but I white-knuckled the steering wheel the whole way home. I've tried researching similar encounters around Tillamook. There are stories, more than you'd think, but most people don't talk about them openly. There's this unspoken agreement in rural communities like ours. Some things you see in the woods, you just keep to yourself unless you want to be the town crazy person. I don't know what I saw those 2 times. I don't know if it was the same creature or if there are more of them out there. What I do know is that I'm never comfortable in the woods around here anymore. I feel watched. When I hike or camp with friends, I'm always the one suggesting we leave before dark, always the one sleeping closest to the center of the group. To this day, I can't explain what those things were. I just know they were real, they were intelligent, and they live in the forests around my hometown. And sometimes, when the wind is right, I swear I can still catch that distinctive smell, that putrid, musky odor that first warned us something was wrong at the bus stop all those years ago. Story 16. I still get goosebumps when I think about what happened that autumn morning back in '86. I don't share this story much. Most people just think you're crazy or looking for attention. But I know what I saw, and after all these years, I still can't explain it. I'd been out of the Navy for about 3 years by then, trying to readjust to civilian life in southern Ohio. Bow hunting became my therapy in a way, just me, the woods, and the quiet. That year, I'd been scouting a spot in what's now Wayne National Forest in Gallia County since early September. It was an old strip mine area that had grown over, not the prettiest place with its scarred landscape, but good for deer. They liked to move through the patchy woods between the old mine roads. I'd built several stands throughout a 2-mile stretch that had a couple small ponds. Nothing fancy, just platforms secured to trees with some basic cover. My favorite was about 50 yards from the smaller of the 2 ponds. Good visibility, but also good cover. That morning I got up at 3:30, made some coffee in my thermos, and drove out in my old Chevy pickup. It was cold, that damp, bone-chilling kind of cold we get in Ohio when autumn really takes hold. I remember checking my watch when I parked at the access road, 4:45. Still pitch black out. I grabbed my bow, strapped on my quiver, clicked on my small flashlight and started the half-mile hike to my stand. The forest was dead quiet that morning. Usually you hear something, an owl, distant coyotes, something. But there was nothing, just the sound of my boots on the ground and my breathing. I didn't think much of it then. I reached my stand around 5, climbed up carefully in the dark, and got settled in. I remember checking my bow, making sure my arrows were secure, and taking a sip of coffee from my thermos. Then I just waited for first light. As dawn approached, this heavy fog settled in. Not unusual for that area with the ponds nearby, but this was thick, like soup. I could barely see 20 yards in any direction. The light was just this diffuse glow through the mist. That's when I first heard it, this weird buzzing sound. At first, I thought maybe it was bees, but that made no sense. It was too cold for bees to be active, and it didn't sound quite right anyway. It was more like a hum with a buzz quality to it. Hard to describe. It wasn't mechanical, definitely biological, but unlike anything I'd heard before. Not quite insect, not quite mammal. I remember sitting up straighter, straining to locate the source. It seemed to be coming from the direction of the pond, but the fog made it impossible to see clearly. The sound got slightly louder, then would fade, like whatever was making it was moving around. The fog started lifting a bit around 7, and I could make out the edge of the pond. That's when I caught movement from the corner of my eye. My first thought was bear. We'd had a few black bear sightings that season, though they're not common in Ohio. It was definitely large and dark. I slowly turned my head, trying not to make any sudden movements. As the figure emerged from the mist, I felt every hair on my body stand up. My mind couldn't process what I was seeing at first. Standing there, about 40 yards away at the edge of the pond, was what I can only describe as a female something. She stood upright, completely bipedal, probably 6.5 feet tall. She was covered in dark hair, not fur exactly, but longer hair, almost black with some brown mixed in. And she was holding something in her arms. I remember my hand instinctively going to my bow, but I couldn't move beyond that. I was frozen. Not out of fear exactly, more like complete shock. My brain kept cycling through possibilities, bear standing up, person in a suit, but I knew immediately it wasn't either of those things. The creature was cradling what looked like an infant in her arms. The baby was smaller, with the same dark hair nestled against her chest, and she was making this humming sound, the buzzing I'd been hearing, but now I could tell it was some kind of vocalization. She was looking down at the baby, completely focused on it, humming this strange, almost musical pattern. I sat there, not daring to breathe, watching as she approached the edge of the pond. Her movements were smooth, deliberate, nothing like the awkward gait you'd expect from someone in a costume. She knelt down at the water's edge, still cradling the infant with one arm, and scooped water with her free hand. The gentleness of it is what struck me. She brought the water up and either gave it to the baby to drink or was using it to clean it. I couldn't tell exactly from my position, but there was such care in the movement. She repeated this 3 or 4 times, all while continuing that humming sound. I remember noticing details, how the muscles in her back and shoulders moved under the hair, the proportions of her body that were just off for a human. Her arms were longer, her shoulders broader. Her face was flat with a pronounced brow ridge, but her eyes, I could see them occasionally when she would glance down at the infant. They looked almost human. The whole time, she seemed completely unaware of my presence. I was downwind from her, so she couldn't smell me, and I hadn't made a sound. I just sat there, barely breathing, watching this impossible scene unfold. After maybe 2 minutes of tending to the baby at the water's edge, she straightened up. Then she turned and walked directly away from the pond, straight through a briar patch that was so dense I'd avoided it during all my scouting trips. The thorns were vicious in that patch, would tear right through clothing. But she moved through it like it wasn't even there, not hurrying, just this purposeful stride, still holding the baby, still humming. And then she was gone. The humming faded, and I was left sitting in my stand, wondering if I'd lost my mind. I don't know how long I sat there. Could have been 10 minutes, could have been an hour. My coffee had gone cold in the thermos when I finally took another sip. My hands were shaking so badly I nearly dropped it. Eventually, I climbed down from the stand. I remember my legs feeling wobbly, like I'd run a marathon. I walked over to the pond, to the exact spot where she had knelt. There, in the soft mud at the edge of the water, was a single footprint. It was huge, easily twice the size of my boot, and clearly showed 5 toes. It wasn't a bear print. It wasn't anything I recognized. I didn't have a camera with me. This was '86. We didn't carry phones with cameras back then. I thought about trying to make a cast of the print somehow, but I had nothing to use. By the time I could have gone back to the truck and returned with something, I knew it might rain or animals could disturb it, so I just stared at it, trying to burn the image into my memory. I walked over to the briar patch next. There was a clear path through it. The thorny vines were pushed aside and broken in places. I tried to follow, but gave up after a few steps when the thorns started tearing at my hunting clothes. I didn't hunt at all that day. I packed up and went home, sat at my kitchen table, and tried to make sense of what I'd seen. I called in sick to work the next day, couldn't focus on anything. I went back to that same spot a week later, in the middle of the day. The footprint was gone, washed away by rain. The path through the briars had mostly sprung back. There was no evidence of what I'd seen. I never told anyone except my wife at first. Years later, I mentioned it to my brother after a few beers. Both of them believed I saw something, but I could tell they weren't sure exactly what. I can't blame them. If someone told me this story, I'd have a hard time believing it too. It wasn't until years later that I learned about the history of strange sightings in that area, going back to the 1800s. Locals had stories about wild people or forest giants in those woods long before anyone was talking about Bigfoot or Sasquatch on TV shows. I've spent a lot of time thinking about what I saw that day. The thing that stays with me most isn't the shock or the impossibility of it, it's the tenderness. That creature, whatever she was caring for her baby. The way she hummed to it, the gentle way she gave it water. There was love there, real, recognizable love. I went back to that hunting ground many times over the next few years. Never saw anything like that again. Never heard that strange humming. But I always felt watched in those woods after that day. Always had the sense that I was the one being observed. I'm 67 now, and I've had a lot of experiences in my life. Served my country, raised kids, seen some amazing things, but nothing, absolutely nothing, compares to those few minutes by that pond in '86. I don't know what she was, where she came from, or where she went. But I know what I saw, and it changed how I see the world and our place in it. Sometimes I wonder about that baby, if it's still out there somewhere, grown up now. And sometimes, when I'm in the woods and the fog rolls in, I find myself listening for that hum,